Oh, wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Shabbat shalom. Just want to go ahead real quick and talk about this person and his writings. So we're going to read a couple of his writings. So before we do, I just wanted to go ahead and introduce you guys to him so you can know who he is first. So William Apes says here, 1798 to 1839. That's when he lived. He was a Pequot, also known as William Apes, before 1837, was a Methodist minister, writer, activist of so-called mixed race descent. Apes spent most of his career in New England. So we're going to read one of his published works, The Son of the Forest. All right, that's something we're going to read today. It says William Apes was born in 1798 in Coleraine in northwestern Massachusetts to William and Candace Apes of the Pequot tribe. According to his autobiography, his father was mixed Pequot and European American, as Apes' so-called white or European paternal grandfather had married a Pequot woman. So that's on his paternal side, right? His grandfather, but it seems the rest of them supposed to be Indians, his parents both. He claimed descent from King Philip through his mother. So on his mother's side, he's Pequot as well, who also had some European American and African American ancestry, huh? So-called black. Well, we know it's not African, so what they mean? Where's the color coming from? Where's the color coming from? The Pequot side or the European side? Probably both. Most likely both. This is what I'm saying, all right? Let's see what he has to say, though. It says, until the age of 5, Apes lived with his family, including 2 brothers and 2 sisters near Coleraine. Now, before I begin, guys, the reason I'm reading this to you today, it's going to be a pretty long read. I hope you guys don't mind, but I hope you enjoy it anyways. We want to get an account from the horse's mouth, right? Itself, from a person who was an Indian. He's going to give his opinions. He's going to tell you what he knows about his people, what has happened to American Indians in general, the atrocities, how they were, their characters, their morality, how they lived, their traditions, who they resembled, especially. You guys are going to see. We're going to talk a lot about how they resemble the Hebrew people, so-called Hebrew or Israelite people, the ancient biblical people, the chosen people of the Most High, and how many people, including him, have compared them and found them to be part of the tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob, okay? The Hebrew people. All right, so we're going to get a lot of, hopefully it's not too boring for you guys, but stick around all the way to the end. You guys are going to see there is a lot of good parts in this reading and different parts of the video. So, if you can have the patience to, hear me read this to you and learn with me, I would really appreciate that. And I hope, again, you guys enjoy it. We're going to get the perspectives of William Apes and many other primary sources that he's going to quote, all right? That he's going to quote. These are all his books. Again, he has more than, 2 books. We're only going to read 2 of them today, but he has many writings. I just want you guys to know that. All right? William Apes, let's go. Okay, so the first book by William Apes we're going to just quickly read is called The Increase of the Kingdom of Christ, a Sermon by William Apes, as a missionary of the Pequot tribe of Indians. This is from 1831, and it says here, the Indians, the 10 lost tribes. In my travels from place to place, I have frequently met with persons who have impiously called in question the being, majesty, power, and justice of the God of the universe. The men have but finite conceptions of the infinite glory with which the great first cause is surrounded is too well established to admit a single doubt, as reason and good sense the world over teach us that we cannot fathom a measureless depth with a measured line. Some have ever arraigned the justice of God. I have been asked time and again whether I did not sincerely believe that God had more respect to the European man than to the untutored son of the forest. I answered, and always answer such in the language of Scripture, No God is no respecter of persons. I might meet a question of this kind by proposing another example. Is not the European man as sinful by nature as the red man or copper-colored man, huh? Uneducated and unrenewed by divine grace? Is he not a heathen? Is he not an enemy to God and righteousness, prone to the commission of every crime, however fragrant in its nature and its tendencies? Does not the European man, however gifted and eloquent and learned and popular, grow up and sicken and die? With thinking men, those whose sentiments are worthy of regard, there is but one opinion, and that is that the soul of the Indian is immortal. And indeed, the conviction rests with great force on the minds of many intelligent men, men of profound reasoning and the deep and studious research, that the Indian tribes now melting away like dewdrops in the morning sun are no less than the remnants of that people, the records of whose history has been blotted out from among the nations of the earth. Okay? Oh, wow. He's saying Psalms 83 erased their name from being nations. Listen to what he's saying. These are the people. These are the remnants. Those who have been blotted out, huh? Erased from history, paper genocide, reclassified, many tax put onto them among the nations of the earth, whose history, if history they have, is a series of cruelties and persecutions without a parallel. That nation peculiarly and emphatically blessed of God, his own highly favored and chosen people. His chosen people, the Great Spirit, Hawa, preserved by the wondrous interposition of divine power, brought up out of Egypt and their cruel bondage by miraculous means, inducted into the promised land, flowing with milk and honey, but strong in the purpose of rebellion. Their murmurs rose to heaven, calling loudly for vengeance, and when the Savior of sinners made his humble appearance on the earth, to redeem its inhabitants from the thraldom of sin and death, and restore them to the favor of heaven, they received him not. They disdained him, simply because he did not come in princely splendor, swaying the conqueror's scepter of blood and carnage, and dominion over the nations. They cried out, "He is not the Christ. Crucify him. Crucify him and nail the Lord of the universe to the cross." All right, we dodged the hijacks. They, like Pharaoh, hardened their hearts. They were hanging Indians, too. Suddenly, the storm of divine wrath overtook them. Their city, over which he who suffered on the cross had shed tears of sorrow, was razed to the ground, and once the warlike and powerful nation of the Israelites melted away before the overwhelming and countless legions of foes that rose up to chastise and crush them. That the Indians are indeed no other than the descendants of the 10 lost tribes, the subscriber has no doubt. Right, this is an Indian himself, right? He is one of the few remaining descendants of a once powerful tribe of Indians, and he looks forward with a degree of confidence to the day as being not far distant when ample justice shall be done, the red man or the copper-colored man, by his European brother, when he shall be allowed that station in the scale of being and intelligence which unerring wisdom designed him to occupy. It is a matter of deep and lasting regret that the character of the Indians who occupied this widespread and goodly heritage, or godly heritage, when men of pale faces came over, the Europeans, right, the pierceless solitudes of the mighty ocean with their large canoes, and were received with all the kindly feelings of native innocence. I say that it is deeply to be regretted that their character should be so grossly misrepresented and misunderstood. They have been accused of cruelty and perfidy of the basest nature, of crimes and vices of the most degrading cast. Again and again are the people of this happy land referred back to the period of its early settlement, and their attention directed to the smoking ruins of villages and the cries of suffering and distress. Scenes like these, I grant, are sufficient to harrow up the mind, but in contemplating the sufferings of their early brethren, the Europeans seem almost to forget the corroding sorrows of the poor Indians, the wrongs and calamities which were heaped upon them. follow them into the deep recesses of their wilderness solitudes, hear their long and loud complaints, when driven by the pale faces whom they had kindly received, and cheerfully in the fullness of their friendship, sustained through days and months of sorrow and want and affliction, from their happy homes and resting place of their fathers. Can you wonder, friends, that they should have resisted manfully against the encroachment of their white neighbors? But I think that history declares that when this continent was first discovered, that its inhabitants were a harmless, inoffensive, obliging people. They were alike free from the blandishments and vices of civilized life. They received the strangers from the world beyond the waters with every token of esteem, high-minded, noble, generous, and confident to a fault. They placed implicit confidence in the professions of their visitors. They sought not the aim and the sign of the European man, and the chains of the cruel bondage were firmly entwined around them before the illusions was dispelled. And when their eyes were opened, they beheld not as the portion of their cup, but servitude and sorrow. All right, servitude, these are your slaves. Hundreds of thousands perished before the face of the European man. Suffice it to say, what is already known, that the European man came upon our shores. He grew taller and taller until his shadow was cast over all the land. In his shade, the mighty tribe of olden time wilted away. A few of the remnant of multitudes, long since gathered to their fathers, are all that remain, and they are on their march to eternity. All right. That was written by William Apes. All right, a Pequot Indian. I'm going to read from this book now. It's also from William Apes. It says here, A Son of the Forest. The experience of William Apes, or Apes, a native of the forest, comprising a notice of the Pequot tribe of Indians written by himself. This is from 1829. It says here, ever since the discovery of America by the celebrated navigator Columbus, the hijack, you can't discover a place where people are already there for thousands and thousands of years, right? Either way, we understand what they're saying when he came in on Conquest. The civilized or enlightened natives of the Old World regarded its inhabitants as an extensive race of savages. That's what they thought of the Indians, huh? Of course, they were treated as barbarians, and for nearly 2 centuries they suffered without intermission, as the Europeans acted on the principle that might make right, or makes right, and if they could succeed in defrauding the natives out of their lands and drive them from the seaboard, they were satisfied for a time. With this end in view, they sought to engage them in war, destroy them by thousands with ardent spirits and fatal disorders unknown to them before. Every European vice that had a tendency to debase and ruin both body and soul was introduced among them. Their avowed object was to obtain possession of the godly inheritance of the Indian, and in their enlightened estimation, the end justified the means. When I reflect upon the complicated ills to which my brethren have been subject, ever since history has recorded their existence, their wanderings, their perils, their privations, and their many sorrows, and the fierceness of the persecution of which marked their dwellings, and their persons for destruction, when I take into consideration the many ancient usages and customs observed religiously by them, and which have so near and close resembled to the manners, etc., of the ancient Israelites, I am led to believe that they are none other than the descendants of Jacob, some American Indians, right, and the long-lost tribes of Israel. In view of this subject, the late William Bodinot says that there is a possibility that these unhappy children of misfortune may yet be proved to be the descendants of Jacob, and if so, that though cast off for their heinous transgressions, they have not been altogether forsaken, and will hereafter appear to have been in all their dispersions and wanderings the subject of God's divine protection and gracious care. The writer above referred to is of the opinion that if the natives had been favored with early instruction, and their cause had been faithfully and fully represented to posterity, the character would have been considered in a very different point of light from what it is now, or what it now is. Talking about you, man. It is often said of the savages, in parentheses, that their mode of carrying on war and the method of treating their prisoners is cruel and barbarous in the extreme. But did not the Europeans set them the brutal example? Didn't they come also with their brutality and barbarity and cruelty? When they first visited these shores, they found the wilderness, as they called it, teeming with a healthy and happy population. Here they found, after the first and natural impulses of fear had subsided, fast friends and the sons of the forest. The sons of the forest, huh? And what return did they receive for all their friendship? The following extracts from the Bishop of Chapia de las Casas, who came over from Spain for the purpose of teaching the natives, is directly in point. I was one of the first who went to America. This is de las Casas, right? Remember who he is, from the 1500s. Neither curiosity nor interest prompted me to undertake so long and dangerous a voyage. The saving the souls of the heathen was my sole object. Why was I not permitted, even at the expense of my blood, to ransom so many thousands of souls who fell unhappy victims of avarice and lust? It was said that the barbarous executions were necessary to punish or check the rebellion of the Americans. But to whom was this owing? Did not these people receive the Spaniards who first came among them with gentleness and humanity? Did they not show more joy in proportion and lavishing treasure upon them? The Spaniards did greediness in receiving it, but our avarice was not yet satisfied. Though they gave up to us their lands, their riches, we would take from them their wives, their children, and their liberty, all right, enslavement. To blacken the characters of these unhappy people, their enemies assert they are scarce human creatures. But it is we who ought to blush for having been less men and more barbarous than they. They are represented as a stupid people and addicted to vice. But have they not contracted most of their vices from the examples of Christians? Yeah, the Christians brought all that sin in example, right? But it must be granted that the Indians still remain untamed with many vices unusual among Europeans, such as ambition, blasphemy, swearing, treachery, and many such monsters which have not yet taken place among them. They have scarce an idea of them. All nations are equally free. One nation has no right to infringe on the freedom of another. Let us do these people as we would have them have done to us, on a change of circumstances. What a strange method is this of propagating the gospel, that holy law of grace, which from being slaves to Satan initiates us into the freedom of the children of God. The Abbe Clavijero, another Spanish writer, confirms this idea of the South Americans. All right, Clavijero says, "We have had intimate converse," says he, "with the Americans, have lived some years in a seminary destined for their instruction, attentively observed their character, their genius, their disposition and manner of thinking, and have besides examined with the utmost diligence their ancient history, their religion, their government, their laws, and their customs. After such long experience and study of them, we declare that the mental qualities of the Americans are not in the least inferior to those of the Europeans. Who were the first aggressors, and who first imbrued their hands in blood? Not the Indian. No, he treated the stranger as a brother and a friend, until that stranger whom he had received upon his fertile soul endeavored to enslave him, they're not enslaving Africans, and resorted to brutal violence to accomplish his designs. And if they committed excesses, they only followed in the footsteps of the Europeans or so-called whites, who must blame themselves for provoking their dependent and unyielding spirits, and by a long series of cruelty and bloodshed drove them to arms. So this is why I'm saying you gotta dodge the haja when I switched the word white to European, because in Clavijero's original writing, he didn't use the word white. Okay, this is why you gotta understand. But they mean Europeans in general, whatever color, you know. This was the case in those colonies of Virginia, where the natives rose upon the whites, so Europeans who in their turn waged a destructive war against the Indians and murdered men, women, and children. Dr. Robertson, in his History of America, says that the English Like the Spaniards, regardless of those principles of faith, honor, and humanity, which regulate hostilities among civilized nations and set bounds to their race, the English deemed everything allowable that tended to accomplish their designs. They hunted the Indians like wild beasts, rather than enemies, and as the pursuit of them to their places of retreat in the woods was both difficult and dangerous, they endeavored to allure them from their inaccessible fastness by offers of peace and promises of oblivion, made with such an artful appearance of sincerity as deceived the crafty Indian chief and induced the Indians to return in the year 1623 to their former settlements and resume their usual peaceful occupations. The behavior of the two people seemed now to be perfectly reversed. All right, you see how they tricked the Indians. The Indians, like men acquainted with the principles of integrity and good faith, on which the intercourse between nations is founded, confined in the reconciliation and lived in absolute security without suspicion of danger, while the English, with the perfidious craft, were preparing to imitate savages in their revenge and cruelty. On the approach of harvest, when a hostile attack would be most formidable and fatal, the English fell suddenly on all the Indian plantations and murdered every person on whom they could lay hold, and drove the rest to the woods, where so many perished with hunger that some of the tribes nearest to the English were totally extirpated. Robertson, again, speaking of the war in New England between Connecticut and Providence in their first attempt against the Pequot Indian, says that the Indians had secured their town, which was on a rising ground in a swamp with palisades. The New England troops, unperceived, reached the palisades. The barking of a dog alarmed the Indians. In a moment, however, they started to their arms and, raising the war cry, prepared to repel the assailants. The English forced their way through into the fort or town and setting fire to the huts, which were covered with reeds. The confusion and terror quickly became general. Many of the women and children perished in the flames, and the warriors endeavoring to escape were either slain by the English or falling into the hands of the Indian allies, who surrounded the fort at a distance, were reserved for a more cruel fate. The English resolved to pursue their victory, and hunting the Indians from one place of retreat to another. Some subsequent encounters were hardly less fatal than the first action. In less than 3 months, the tribe of the Pequots was extirpated. Right here. Thus, the English stained their laurels by the use they made of victory, instead of treating the Pequots as an independent people who made a gallant effort to defend the property, the rights and freedom of their nation. They retaliated upon them all the barbarities of American war. Some they massacred in cold blood, others they gave up to be tortured by their Indian allies. A considerable number they sold as slaves in Bermuda. Again, what happened to a lot of the Pequot? A considerable number, so most of them actually got sold as slaves in Bermuda. The rest were reduced to servitude among themselves. Who were they enslaving? American Indians. Who were they sending to these islands in the Caribbean? American Indians. Dr. Boudinot says that this tribe, the Pequots referred to above, were a principal nation of the East and very forcibly reminds one of the similarity of the same name in Jeremiah 1:21, where the inhabitants of Pequot, listen to that, guys. All right, I've been meaning to actually do a video on this finding of the Pequot mentioned in the Bible, I believe, Pequot. And look at it right here, we're reading it. I didn't know we were going to read this. Where the inhabitants of Pequot are particularly mentioned, and also in Ezekiel 23:2 and 3, the difference in spelling one with a K and the other with a Q is no uncommon thing. The Indian languages being very guttural, the K is generally used where an Englishman would use the Q. Pequot, are in the Bible, So real quick, I told you I had these links saved actually if I was going to do a video about it. I just haven't done it, but since they brought it up in this book, as you guys can see, they're talking about the Pequot. Assyrian Babylonian, huh? Assyrian Babylonian, huh? An Aramean tribe in southern Babylon on the east bank of the lower Tigris River. See, this is we start picturing that side of the world over there. When we talk about ancient world, the ancient times, what if that land was actually up there in New England, connected to the British Isles? Samaria, Chaldea, Assyria, Acadia, Acadians, Acadia. When it was one continent, Ruta. Pequot, huh? Pequot. So this is what they were talking about, right? And this other website, it says here Pequot, 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 and name applied in Jeremiah 50:21 and Ezekiel 23:23 to the Chaldeans. To the Chaldeans, huh? You see how it got different variations here. They said Assyrian Babylonian tribe. Now it's called Chaldeans here. Who's the ancient Chaldeans? What is the connection with ancient Ireland and Chaldea? And what is the connection with ancient Ireland and the ancient Americas? Again, going back to when there was land bridges. It was all connected. Pequot, huh? Chaldeans, Picts, huh? So back in the book, he's saying about the Buddha, and I say, hey, the Pequot might be the Pequot. Huh. Columbus was as competent to form a proper estimate of the character of the natives as any other man. In his account to his patrons, he says, I swear to your majesties that there is not a better people in the world than these, more affectionate, affable, or mild. They love their neighbors as themselves. Their language is the sweetest, softest, and most cheerful, for they always speak smiling. That the Europeans were treated by the natives of New England with the utmost kindness, there is no doubt. The Reverend Mr. Cushman, in a sermon preached at Plymouth in 1620, thus speaks of the treatment of the Indians to the Europeans. The Indians are said to be the most cruel and treacherous people in all these parts, even like lions, but to us they have been like lambs, so kind, so submissive and trusty as a man may truly say. Many Christians are not so kind or sincere, though when we came first into this country we were few, and many of us very sick, and many died by reason of the cold and wet, it being the death of winter, and we having no houses or shelter. Yet when there was no sick able persons among us, and the Indians came daily to us by hundreds, with their sakims or kings, and might in 1 hour have made despatch of us, yet such fear was upon them as that they never offered us the least injury in word or deed. And by reason of one Tisquanto that lives amongst us and can speak English, we have daily commerce with their kings and can know what is done or intended towards us among the savages. All right, he's talking about Squanto. Huh. Governor Hutchinson bore unqualified testimony to the kindness and courtesy of the natives. The celebrated William Penn represented them as being a kind and benevolent people. Mr. Smith, in his History of New Jersey, says, they manifested the greatest cordiality and friendship for the inhabitants. The real character of the Aborigines is thus noted by Father Charlevoix, who had by extensive travel among the tribes scattered from Quebec to New Orleans a great opportunity of forming a proper estimate of Indian customs, manners, etc. And speaking of the real character of the nations, he says that with a mien and appearance altogether savage, and with manners and customs which favored the greatest barbarity, they enjoy all the advantages of society. At first view, one would imagine them without form of government, laws of subordination, and subject to the wildest caprice. Nevertheless, they rarely deviate from certain maxims and usages founded on good sense alone, which holds the place of law, and supplies, in short, the want of legal authority. They manifest much stability in their engagements. They have solemnly entered upon patience and affliction, as well as submission to what they apprehend to be the appointment of Providence. In all this they manifest a nobleness of soul and constancy of mind at which we rarely arrive with all our philosophy and religion. They are neither slaves to ambition nor interest, the two passions that have so much weakened in us the sentiments of humanity, which the kind author of nature has engraven on the human heart and kindled those of covetousness which are as yet generally unknown among them. The nearer view we take of our savages, the more we discover in them some valuable qualities, the chief part of the principles by which they regulate their conduct, the general maxims by which they govern themselves, and the bottom of their characters have nothing which appears barbarous. The ideas, though now quite confused, which they have retained of a first being, the traces, though almost effaced, of a religious worship, which they appear formerly to have rendered to the supreme deity, and the faint marks which we observe, even in their most indifferent actions, of the ancient belief and the primitive religion, may bring them more easily than we think of into the way of truth, and make their conversation to Christianity more easily to be affected than that of more civilized nations. All right, that's what they were saying about the American Indians, your ancestors. The characters, right? And a lot of people admired them and saw it in them. Continues as Mr. Bodinot, after speaking more particularly of the general character of the Indian nations, of their kindness to women and children who are taken prisoners, and of their great delicacy towards the former, of their haughty tempers, etc., proceeds to give the following extract from Wine's History of America. He says, "Let us come nearer home, who set them for the example of barbarity, even to those whom they invaded and plundered of their property, deprived of their lands and rendered their whole country a scene of horror, confusion, and distress. Wine in his History of America tells us that the New England people, in an early day, as we have already seen, made an attack upon the Pequot Indians and drove 800 of them, with about 200 of their women and children, into a swamp. A fog arising, the men escaped except a few, who were either killed or wounded, but the helpless women and children surrendered at discretion. The Sakim's wife, who some time before had rescued the Wethersfield maidens and returned them home, was among them. She made two requests which arose from a tenderness and virtue not common among savages. First, that her chastity might remain unviolated. Second, that her children might not be taken from her. The amiable sweetness of her countenance and the modest dignity of her deportment were worthy of the character she supported for innocence and justice, and were sufficient to show the Europeans that even barbarous nations sometimes produce instances of heroic virtue. It is not said by the historian whether her requests were granted or not, but that the women and children were dispersed through the neighborhood colonies, all right, as slaves, the children, Pequot children. The male infants accepted, who were sent to the Bermudas. So the women they kept, you see that, guys? You see that happen a lot. The women they kept, the men they were sent as slaves to other parts of the Americas or other parts of the world, guys. You hear that? The males to Bermudas, the females locally. They're all slaves. In volume 66, indeed, the Indians on their part, been able to answer in writing, they might have formed a contrast between themselves and their mortal enemies, the civilized subjects of Great Britain. They might have recapitulated their conduct and the persecution of Indians, witches, Quakers in New England, Indians and Negroes in New York, and the cruelty with which the Aborigines were treated in Virginia. These invaders of a country and the peaceful possession of a free and happy people, entirely independent as the deer of the forest, made war upon them with all the advantage of firearms and the military knowledge of Europe in the most barbarous manner, not observing any rules of nations or the principles of modern warfare, much less the benign injunctions of the gospel. They soon taught the Indians by their fatal examples to retaliate with the most inveterate malice and diabolical cruelty. The civilized Europeans, though flying from the persecution of the Old World, did not hesitate to deny their professed religion of peace and goodwill to men by murdering men, women, and children, selling captives as slaves, again, selling captives as slaves, not Africans, Indians, cutting off the heads and quartering the bodies of those who were killed, nobly fighting for their liberty and their country in self-defense and setting them up in various places in ignoble triumph at their success. Philip, an independent sovereign of the Pequots, who disdained to submit but died fighting at the head of his men, had his head cut off and carried on a pole with great rejoicings. You guys see here what they did to King Philip. To New Plymouth they took it, where wine says his skull is to be seen to this day. It's still there, 1823, right? When they made this book. Guys, can you believe that? They still had this from the like 1600s, I believe. All right, and that's in Vitae, Volume 1. This conduct produced greater violence and barbarity on the part of the other nations of Indians in the neighborhood, often joined by French Europeans who acted at times worse than the native Indians, and by this means a total disregard of promises and pledges, faith on both sides, became common. Continuing, it says, after reading the above, I presume that no person will doubt that great injustice has been done to the Indians. And I also think that no liberal mind will say that they are only savages. All right, that's true. It is a matter of sober fact that the natives, on their first acquaintance with the Europeans, manifested themselves generous, high minded, kind, and hospitable. And these feelings marked all their intercourse with the Europeans, while they were treated with humanity. And it was not till after repeated aggressions on the part of the Europeans, not until they were overreached and their friends and relatives carried into hopeless captivity, carried as slaves, again, not Africans. You see all these accounts, you see when you start reading the primary sources, guys, and this is what I'm trying to show you, a lot of these videos too. I'll be paying attention. I hope you're adding up all the numbers all these years. I've been telling you, who are they really been enslaving? They had a lot of local, free labor that they could take advantage of, and they did. They didn't have to go to another continent and risk getting millions. No, they had them here, millions of people being put into captivity, like the Pequots right here, that they manifested the deep and settled hatred to the Europeans, which may very properly have termed an hereditary animosity. The social kindness of the Indians has been referred to by many writers. Lepage Duprat says that they behaved towards each other with a kindness and regard not to be found among civilized nations. In his History of Louisiana, he says, we are equally charmed with that natural and unaffected gravity which reigns in all their behavior and all their actions and in the greatest part of their diversions. Also with the civility and defense they show to their equals in the respect of young people to the aged. And lastly, never to see them quarrel among themselves with those indecent expressions, oaths and curses so common among us, all which are proofs of good sense and great command of temper. In short, to make a brief portrait of these people, with a savage appearance, manners, and customs which are entirely barbarous, there are observable among them a social kindness free from almost all imperfections which so often disturb the peace of society among us. They appear to be without passion, but they do not in cold blood, and sometimes through principle, which the most violent and unbridled passion produces in those who give no ear to reason. They seem to live the most wretched life in the world, and yet they were perhaps the only happy people on earth before the knowledge of the objects which so work upon and seduce us had excited in them desires which ignorance kept in supineness, but which have not as yet in 1730 made any great ravages among them. We discover in them a mixture of the fiercest and most gentle manners, the imperfections of wild beasts, and the virtues and qualities of the heart and mind, which do the greatest honor to human nature. He further observes that upon an acquaintance with the Indians, he was convinced that it was wrong to denominate them savages, as they are capable of making good use of their reason, and their sentiments are just, that they have a degree of prudence, faithfulness, and generosity exceeding that of nations who would be offended at being compared with them. No people, says he, are most hospitable and free than the Indians. Hence, they may be esteemed a happy people if that happiness was not impeded by their passionate fondness for spirituous liquors and the foolish notion they hold in common with many professing Christians of gaining reputation and esteem by their prowess in war, but to whom they owe their uncommon attachment to both these evils. It is not the European people who came to them with destruction in each hand, while we did but deceive ourselves with the vain notion that we were bringing the glad tidings of salvation to them. Instead of this, we have possessed these unoffending people with so horrid an idea of our principles that among themselves they call us the accursed people, and their great numbers, when first discovered, showed that they had comparatively but few wars between we came among them. The Indian character, I have observed before, has been greatly misrepresented. Justice has not, and I may add, justice cannot be fully done to them by the historian. My people have had no press to record their sufferings or to make known their grievances. On this account, many a tale of blood woe has never been known to the public. And during the wars between the natives and the Europeans, the latter could, through the medium of the newspaper press, circulate extensively every exaggerated account of Indian cruelty, while the poor natives had no means of gaining the public ear. It therefore affords me much gratification to bear testimony of the philanthropy of some of the European men, and that his brethren had found compassion in the breast of those who sought to do justice to the poor despised tribes of the wilderness. And I cannot refrain from presenting to my readers the following article, which originally appeared in the Analectic magazine during the time that the United States was engaged in a war with the Creek Indians. It says here from the Analectic magazine, right? He's quoting. It says traits of the Indian character. The rights of the savage have seldom been deeply appreciated by the European man. In peace, he is the dupe of mercenary rapacity. In war, he is regarded as a ferocious animal, whose death is a question of mere precaution and convenience. Man is cruelly wasteful of life when his own safety is endangered and he is sheltered by impunity, and little mercy is to be expected from him, who feels the sting of the reptile and is conscious of the power to destroy. It has been the lot of the unfortunate aborigines of this country to be doubly wronged by the European man, first driven from their native soil by the sword of the invader, and then darkly slandered by the pen of the historian, right? Paper genocide. The former has treated them like beasts of the forest. The latter has written volumes to justify him in his outrages. The former found it easier to exterminate them than to civilize, the latter to abuse than to discriminate. The hideous appellations of savage and pagan were sufficient to sanction the deadly hostilities of both, and the poor wanderers of the forest were persecuted and dishonored, not because they were guilty, but because they were ignorant. The same prejudices seem to exist in common circulation at the present day, still happening today. We form our opinions of the Indian character from the miserable hordes that infest our frontiers. These, however, are degenerate beings, enfeebled by the vices of society without being benefited by its arts of living. The independence of thought and action that formed the main pillar of their character has been completely prostrated, and their whole moral fabric lies in ruins. Their spirits are debased by conscious inferiority, and their native courage completely daunted by the superior knowledge and power of their enlightened neighbors. Society has advanced upon them like a many-headed monster, breathing every variety of misery. Before it went forth pestilence, famine, and the sword. and in its train came the slow but exterminating curse of trade. What former did not sweep away, what the former did not sweep away, the latter has gradually blighted. It has increased their wants without increasing the means of gratification. It has enervated their strength, multiplied their diseases, blasted the powers of their minds, and superinduced on their original barbarity the low vices of civilization. Poverty repining and hopeless poverty, a canker of the mind unknown to sylvan life, corrodes their very hearts. They loiter like vagrants through the settlements, among spacious habitations replete with artificial comforts, which only render them sensible of the comparative wretchedness of their own condition. Luxury spreads its ample board before their eyes, but they are expelled from the banquet. The forest which once furnished them with ample means of subsistence has been leveled to the ground. Waving fields of grain have sprung up in its place, but they have no participation in the harvest. Plenty revels around them, but they are starving amidst its stores. The whole wilderness blossoms like a garden, but they feel like the reptiles that infest it. How different was their case, while yet the undisputed lord of the soil. Their wants were few, and the means of gratifying them within their reach. They saw everyone around them sharing the same lot, enduring the same hardships, living in the same cabins, feeding on the same alignments, and arrayed in the same rude garments. No roof then rose but what was open to the houseless stranger. No smoke curled among the trees, but he was welcome to sit down by his fire and join the hunter in his repast. For says an old historian of New England, their life is so void of care, and they are so loving also that they make use of those things they enjoy as common goods, and are therein so compassionate that rather than one should starve through want, they would starve all. Thus do they pass their time merrily, not regarding our pomp, but are better content with their own, which some men esteem so meanly of. Such were the Indians, while in the pride and energy of primitive simplicity, they resembled those wild plants that thrive best in the shades of the forest, but which shrink from the hand of cultivation, and perish beneath the influence of the sun. In the general mode of estimating the savage character, we may perceive a vast degree of vulgar prejudice and passionate exaggeration without any of the temperate discussion of true philosophy. No allowance is made for the difference of circumstances and the operations of principles under which they have been educated. Virtue and vice, though radically the same, yet differ widely in their influence on human conduct, according to the habits and maxims of the society in which the individual is reared. No being acts more rigidly from rule than the Indian. His whole conduct is regulated according to some general maxims early implanted in his mind. The moral laws that govern him, to be sure, are but few, but then he conforms to them all. The European man abounds in laws of religion, morals, and manners, but how many does he actually violate? How many does he violate, huh? A common cause of accusation against the Indians is the faithlessness of their friendships and their sudden provocations to hostility, but we do not make allowance for their peculiar modes of thinking and feeling and the principles by which they are governed. Besides, the friendship of the whites toward the poor Indians was ever cold, distrustful, oppressive, and insulting. In the intercourse with our frontiers, they are seldom treated with confidence and are frequently subject to injury and encroachment. The solitary savage feels silently but actively. His sensibilities are not diffused over so wide a surface as those of the European man, but they run in steadier and deeper channels. His pride, his affections, his superstitions are all directed towards fewer objects, but the wounds inflicted on them are proportionably severe and furnish motives of hostility which we cannot sufficiently appreciate. Where a community is also limited in number and forms as an Indian tribe one great patriarchal family, the injury of the individual is the injury of the whole. And as their body politic is small, the sentiment of vengeance is almost instantaneously diffused. One council fire sufficient to decide the measure. Eloquence and superstition combine to inflame their minds. The orator awakens all their martial ardor, and they are wrought up to a kind of religious desperation by the visions of the prophet and the dreamer. An instance of one of these sudden exasperations arising from a motive peculiar to the Indian character is extant in an old record of the early settlement of Massachusetts. The planters of Plymouth had defaced the monuments of the dead at Passamaquoddy and had plundered the grave of the Sakim's mother of some skins with which it had been piously decorated. You guys hear what they were doing? Everyone knows the hallowed reverence which the Indians entertain for the sepulchres of their kindred. Even now, tribes that have passed generations exiled from the abodes of their ancestors, when by chance they have been traveling on some mission to our seat of government, have been known to turn aside from the highway for many miles distance, and guided by wonderful accurate tradition, have sought some tumulus buried perhaps in the woods where the bones of their tribe were anciently deposited, and there have passed some time in silent lamentations over the ashes of their forefathers. Influenced by this sublime and holy feeling, the Sakim, whose mother's tomb had been violated in the moment of indignation, gathered his men together and addressed them in the following beautifully simple and pathetic harangue, a harangue which has remained unquoted for nearly 200 years, a pure specimen of Indian eloquence and an affecting monument of filial piety in a savage. When last the glorious light of all the sky was underneath this globe, and birds grew silent, I began to settle, as my custom is to take repose. All right, that's the Indian speaking now. Before mine eyes were fast closed, methought I saw a vision at which my spirit was much troubled, and trembling at that doleful sight, a spirit cried aloud, Behold, my son, whom I have cherished, see the breast that gave thee suck, the hands that lapped thee warm and fed thee off. Canst thou forget to take revenge of those wild people who have defaced my monument in a despiteful manner, disdaining our antiquities and honorable customs? See now, the Sakim's grave lies like the common people, defaced by an ignoble race. Thy mother doth complain and implores thy aid against this thievish people who have newly intruded in our land. If this be suffered, I shall not rest quiet in my everlasting habitation. This said, the spirit vanished, and I, all in a sweat, not able scarce to speak, began to get some strength and recollected my spirits that were fled, and determined to demand your counsel and so solicit your assistance. Continuing, says another cause of violent outcry against the Indians is their inhumanity to the vanquished. This originally arose partly from political and partly from superstitious motives, right? So they had their fake reasons as to why they should go after the Indians and civilize them and get rid of them, right? But these are just superstitions. Where hostile tribes are scanty in their numbers, the death of several warriors completely paralyzes their power, and many an instance occurs in Indian history where a hostile tribe that had long been formidable to its neighbors has been broken up and driven away by the capture of its principal fighting men. This is a strong temptation to the victor to be merciless, not so much as to gratify any cruelty of revenge, as to provide for future security. But they had other motives, originating in a superstitious idea common to barbarous nations, and even prevalent among the Greeks and Romans, that the manes of their deceased friends slain in battle were soothed by the blood of the captives. But those that are not thus sacrificed are adopted into their families and treated with the confidence and affection of relatives and friends. Nay, so hospitable and tender is their entertainment that they will often prefer to remain with their adopted brethren rather than return to the home and the friends of their youth. You see, so even when they held captives, let's say the Indians, right? A lot of the times they treated them so good and, they adopted them that the person wouldn't want to go back to their old town or people. Maybe they had a worse life. So if they had a good life in this one, they didn't want to go back. The inhumanity of the Indians towards their prisoners has been heightened since the intrusion of the whites. We have exasperated what was formerly a compliance with policy and superstition into a gratification of vengeance. They cannot but be sensible that we are the usurpers of their ancient dominion, the cause of their degradation, and the gradual destroyers of their race. They go forth to battle smartened with injuries and indignities which they have individually suffered from the injustice and the arrogance of European men, and they are driven to madness and despair by the widespread and desolation and the overwhelming ruin of our warfare. We set them an example of violence by burning their villages and laying waste their slender means of subsistence, and then wonder that savages will not show moderation and magnanimity towards men who have left them nothing but mere existence and wretchedness. It is a common thing to exclaim against new forms of cruelty. While reconciled by custom, we wink at long established atrocities. What right does the generosity of our conduct give us to rail exclusively at Indian warfare? With all the doctrines of Christianity and the advantages of cultivated morals to govern and direct us, what horrid crimes disgrace the victories of Christian armies? All right, you guys, this is them admitting, all the atrocities they're causing, and that the Indians had a right to defend themselves. Towns laid in ashes, cities given up to the sword, enormities perpetrated at which manhood blushes, and history drops the pen. Well, may we exclaim at the outrages of the scalping knife, but where in the records of Indian barbarity can we point to a violated female? They don't be doing that. They don't be raping women. Indians don't be, that's what he's saying. Yeah, they might be cruel and they might murder and scalp people, but do they rape women just for no reason? Do they even do that at all, like the Europeans? We stigmatize the Indians also as cowardly and treacherous because they use stratagem and warfare in preference to open force. But in this, they are fully authorized by their root code of honor. They are early taught that stratagem is praiseworthy. The bravest warrior thinks it's no disgrace to lurk in silence and take every advantage of his foe. He triumphs in the superior craft and sagacity by which he has been enabled to surprise and massacre an enemy. Indeed, man is naturally more prone to subtlety than open valor, owing to his physical weakness in comparison with other animals. They are endowed with natural weapons of defense, with horns, with tusks, with hooves and talons, but man has to depend on his superior sagacity. In all his encounters, therefore, with these, his proper enemies, he has to resort to stratagem. And when he perversely turns his hostility against his fellow man, he continues the same subtle mode of warfare. The natural principle of war is to do the most harm to our enemy, with the least harm to ourselves. And this, of course, is to be effected by cunning, that chivalric kind of courage which teaches us to despise the suggestions of prudence and to rush in the face of certain danger, is the offspring of society and produced by education. It is honorable because, in fact, it is the triumph of lofty sentiment over an instinctive repugnance to pain, and over those selfish yearnings after personal ease and security which society has condemned as ignoble. It is an emotion kept up by pride and the fear of shame, and thus the dread of real evils is overcome by the superior dread of an evil that exists but in the mind. This may be instanced in the case of a young British officer of great pride, but delicate nerves who was going for the first time into battle. Being agitated by the novelty and awful peril of the scene, he was accosted by another officer of a rough and boisterous character. "What, sir?" cried he. "Do you tremble?" "Yes, sir," replied the other. "And if you were half as much afraid as I am, you would run away." This young officer signalized himself on many occasions by his gallantry, though had he been brought up in savage life or even in a humbler and less responsible situation, it is more than probable he could never have ventured into open action. Besides, we must consider how much the quality of open and desperate courage is cherished and stimulated by society. It has been the theme of many a spirit-stirring song and chivalric story. The minstrel has sung of it in the loftiest strain of his lyre. The poet has delighted to shed around it all the splendors of fiction, and even the historian has forgotten the sober gravity of narration and bursts forth into enthusiasm and rhapsody in its praise. Triumphs and gorgeous pageants have been its reward monuments, where art has exhausted its skill and opulence its treasure, have been erected to perpetuate a nation's gratitude and admiration. Thus, artificially excited courage has arisen to an extraordinary and factitious degree of heroism, and arrayed in all the glorious pomp and circumstance of war, this turbulent quality has ever been able to eclipse many of those quiet but invaluable virtues which silently ennoble the human character and swell the tide of human happiness. But if courage intrinsically consists in the defiance of hunger and pain, the life of the Indian is a continual exhibition of it. He lives in a perpetual state of hostility and risk. Peril and adventure are congenial to his nature, or rather seem necessary to arouse his faculties and give an interest to existence. Surrounded by hostile tribes, he is always equipped for fight, with his weapons in his hands. He traverses vast wildernesses, exposed to the hazards of lonely sickness or lurking enemies or pain and famine. All right. He always got his weapons. He's always packing the Indian. He always had his, he got enemy tribes always, They're trying to say, that was their lifestyle. What do we expect? You come mess with them, they're gonna come scalp you. These guys are ready for war. Stormy lakes present no obstacle to his wanderings, and his light canoe of bark. He sports like a feather on their waves and darts with the swiftness of an arrow down the roaring rapids of the rivers, whitewater rafting Indians, trackless wastes of snow, rugged mountains, the glooms of swamps and morasses, where poisonous reptiles curl among the rank vegetation, are fearlessly encountered by this wanderer of the wilderness. He gains his food by the hardships and dangers of the chase. He wraps himself in the spoils of the bear, the panther, and the buffalo, and sleeps among the thunders of the cataract, or the waterfall, right? No hero of ancient or modern days can surpass the Indian in his lofty contempt of death, and the fortitude with which he sustains all the varied torments with which it is frequently inflicted. Indeed, we here behold him rising superior to the European man, merely in consequence of his peculiar education. The latter rushes to glorious death at the cannon's mouth. The former coolly contemplates his approach and triumphantly endures it, amid the torments of the knife and the protracted agonies of fire. He even takes a savage delight in taunting his persecutors and provoking their ingenuity of torture. And as the devouring flames prey on his very vitals, and the flesh shrinks from the sinews, he raises his last song of triumph, breathing the defiance of an unconquered heart, and invocating the spirits of his fathers to witness that he dies without a groan. Notwithstanding all the obliquity with which the early historians of the colonies have overshadowed the character of the unfortunate natives, some bright gleams will occasionally break through, that throw a degree of melancholy luster on their memories. Facts are occasionally to be met with in their rude annals, which, though recorded with all the coloring of prejudice and bigotry, just speak for themselves, and will be dealt on with applause and sympathy when prejudice shall have passed away. So even when they're talking bad about them, he says there is some good comments about them and truths, right? In between all the hijack. In one of the homely narratives of the Indian wars in New England, there is a touching account of the desolation carried into the tribe of the Pequot Indians. Humanity shudders at the cold-blooded accounts given of indiscriminate butchery on the part of the settlers. In one place we read of the surprisal of an Indian fort in the night, when the wigwams were wrapped in flames, and the miserable inhabitants shot down and slain in attempting to escape, all being dispatched and ended in the course of an hour. You see what they did? After a series of similar transactions, our soldiers, as the historian piously observes, being resolved by God's assistance to make a final destruction of them, the unhappy savages being hunted from their homes and fortresses and pursued with fire and sword, a scanty but gallant band, the sad remnant of the Pequot warriors, with their wives and children, took refuge in the swamp. Burning with indignation and rendered sullen by despair, with hearts bursting with grief at the destruction of their tribe, and spirits cowed and sore at the fancied ignominy of their defeat, They refused to ask their lives at the hands of an insulting foe and preferred death to submission. You see that? As the night drew on, they were surrounded in their dismal retreat in such manner as to render escape impracticable. Thus situated, their enemy plied them with shot all the time, by which means many were killed and buried in the mire. They massacred them. They were trapped in the swamp. We got this story before, right, on the Pequot massacre. In the darkness and fog that precedes the dawn of day, some few broke through the besiegers and escaped into the woods. The rest were killed in the swamp, like sullen dogs, who would rather, in their self-willedness and madness, sit still and be shot through or cut to pieces, than implore for mercy. When the day broke upon this handful of forlorn but dauntless spirits, the soldiers we are told, entered the swamp, saw several heaps of them sitting close together, upon whom they discharged their pieces, laden with 10 or 12 pistol bullets at a time. So even whoever will survive, they were crowded together right in the swamp. All the Indians that had survived after they had started shooting them, and they just finished them off. They killed the rest of them that were all gathered together, at least with 10 or 12 bullets at a time. Putting the muzzles of their pieces under the bows, within a few yards of them, so as besides those that were found dead, many more were killed and sunk into the mere, and never were minded more by friend or foe. Can anyone read this plain, unvarnished tale without admiring the stern resolution, the unbending pride, and the loftiness of spirit that seemed to nerve the hearts of these self-taught heroes and raise them above the instinctive feeling of human nature? When the Gauls laid waste the city of Rome, they found the nobles clothed in their robes and seated with stern tranquillity in their curule chairs. In this manner they suffered death without an attempt at supplication or resistance. Such conduct in them was applauded as noble and magnanimous. In the hapless Indian, it was reviled as obstinate and sullen. So when the Indians did it, they didn't get seen as heroes, is what he's saying. How much are we the dupes of show and circumstance? How different is virtue arrayed in purple and thrown in state from virtue, destitute and naked, reduced to the last stage of wretchedness, and perishing obscurely in a wilderness. Do these records of ancient excesses fill us with disgust and aversion? Let us take heed that we do not suffer ourselves to be hurried into the same iniquities. He's saying, what if this happened to us? Posterity lifts up its hands with horror at past misdeeds, because the passions that urge to them are not felt, and the arguments that persuaded to them are forgotten. But we are reconciled to the present perpetration of injustice by all the selfish motives with which interest chills the heart and silences the conscience. Even at the present advanced day, when we should suppose that enlightened philosophy had expanded our minds and true religion had warmed our hearts into philanthropy, when we have been admonished by a sense of past transgressions and instructed by the indignant censures of candid history, even now we perceive a disposition breaking out to renew the persecutions of these hapless beings. Sober, potted men, far from the scenes of danger, in the security of cities and populous regions, can coolly talk of exterminating measures, can discuss the policy of extirpating thousands. If such is the talk in the cities, what is the temper displayed on the borders? So, they plan to exterminate Indians, he's saying, in foreign lands, and they talk easily of exterminating thousands of Indians. So what do you think they would do when they're here, is what he's saying, in the borders, when they're here, if they already had it planned? The sentence of desolation has gone forth. The roar is up amidst the woods. Implacable wrath, goaded on by interest and prejudice, is ready to confound all rights, to trample on all claims of justice and humanity, and to act over those scenes of sanguinary vengeance, which have too often stained the pages of colonial history. These are not the idle suggestions of fancy. They are wrung forth by facts which still haunt the public mind. All right, this is him writing, later on, like almost 200 years later, talking about what had happened to his people. Remember, this guy is supposed to be mixed African American too. So he would be considered black, right? As yet our government has in some measure restrained the tide of vengeance and inculcated lenity towards the hapless Indians. Such temper is worthy of an enlightened government. Let it still be observed, let sharp rebuke and signal punishment be inflicted on those who abuse their delegated power and disgrace their victories with massacre and conflagration. The enormities of the Indians form no excuse for the enormities of European men. It has pleased heaven to give them but limited powers of mind and feeble lights to guide their judgments. It becomes us who are blessed with higher intellects to thank for them and set them an example of humanity. It is the nature of vengeance, if unrestrained, to be headlong in its actions and to lay up in a moment of passion ample cause for an age's repentance. We may roll over these miserable beings with our chariot wheels and crush them to the earth, but when passion has subsided and it is too late to pity or to save, we shall look back with unavailing compunction at the mangled corses of those whose cries were unheeded in the fury of our career. That's true. That's what we're doing now. We remember all the atrocities, and it's like almost too late, but the damage has been done, but we shall we shall rise again. In a little while the remaining tribes will go the way that so many have gone before. The few hordes that still linger about the shores of Huron and Superior and the tributary streams of the Mississippi will share the fate of those tribes that once lorded it along the proud banks of the Hudson, of that gigantic race that are said to have existed on the borders of the Susquehanna. You see the giants, the Susquehanna, near the Susquehanna, the gigantic race. Listen, a giant drop, right? He's letting you know there was giants that existed on the Susquehanna and of those various nations that flourished about the Potomac and the Rappahannock and that people, the forests of the vast valley of Shenandoah, all right, eastern woodlands, Mississippi, the Southeast Indians. This is all happening to them. Same thing that happened to the Pequot, he's saying, in the 1600s. This is, remember, early 1800s, he's writing this. He still had a lot of damage to do to the other Indian nations. They will vanish like a vapor from the face of the earth. Their very history will be lost in forgetfulness, and the places that now know them will know them no more forever. Wow. You see what happened to a lot of your ancestors, right? They got forgotten, they got reclassified, paper genocide, and their own land doesn't know them anymore, right? They have turned them into Africans. They say, oh, you're not from here, you come from somewhere else. That's so deep what he just said here. He said the places that now know them will know them no more forever. Wow. Or until different, right? Until we make a change. Change is coming. Continuing with William, he says, or if perchance some dubious memorial of them should survive, the lapse of time, it may be in the romantic dreams of the poet to populate in imagination his glades and groves, like the fauns and satyrs and sylvan deities of antiquity. But should he venture upon the dark story of their wrongs and wretchedness, should he tell how they were invaded, corrupted, despoiled, driven from their native abodes and the sepulchres of their fathers, hunted like wild beasts about the earth, and sent down in violence and butchery to the grave, posterity will either turn with horror and incredulity, from the tale, or blush with indignation at the inhumanity of their forefathers. Are we really looking at it like that now? Like, do we understand the atrocities, or have they forgotten because they're giving other people, right? Oh, they don't want to count the American Holocaust. They want to talk about another Holocaust, right? This is what I'm trying to say. Are we really, really remembering and honoring these people and doing something about what happened? Where's the reparations here, right? Where is all that? Not here, right? He's saying, will people really, really look back and see what the atrocities that were committed? We are driven back, said an old warrior, until we can retreat no further. Our hatches are broken, our bows are snapped, our fires are nearly extinguished. A little longer, and the European man will cease to persecute us, for we will cease to exist. Cease to exist as a nation, as a people. Psalms 83. The The nations will not remember your name anymore. The warlike ability of the Indians has been very generously despised by European officers, and this opinion has cost many thousands of men their lives. The following brief account of their military conduct will not be uninteresting to the general reader, and it will show from good authority that the number of Indians engaged in every battle in which they proved victorious has always been exaggerated by their enemies, and European officers, particularly, having often been beaten by a comparatively small number of untutored natives of the forest, have been led to give very false reports of the combats in which they have been engaged. In Colonel Bouquet's last campaign of 1764, I saw, says Colonel Smith, the official return made by the British officers of the number of Indians that were in arms against us in that year, which amounted to 30,000. Wow, 30,000 Indians. What? As I was then a lieutenant in the British service, I told them I was of opinion that there was not above 1,000 in arms against us, as they were divided by Broad Street's army, or Broad Street Army, being then at Lake Erie. The British officers hooted at me and said that they could not make England sensible of the difficulties they labored under in fighting them, and it was expected that their troops could fight the undisciplined savages in America 5-1 as they did the East Indians, and therefore my report would not answer their purpose, as they could not give an honorable account of the war but by augmenting their numbers. Smith was of opinion that from Braddock's defeat until the time of his writings, there never were more than 3,000 Indians at any time in arms against us, west Fort Pitt, and frequently not more than half of that number. Boudinot says that according to the Indians' own account, during the whole of Braddock's War, or from 1755 to 1758, they were killed and took 50 of our people for one that they lost. In the War of 1763, they killed comparatively few of our people and lost more of theirs, as the frontier inhabitants, especially the Virginians, had learned something of their methods of war. Yet even in this war, according to their account, which Smith believed to be true, they killed and took 10 of our people for one they lost. Wow. So, guys, you got to understand what they're trying to say. They're saying the numbers for every one person, every one European that got killed, 50 got killed between certain years, right, of Indians. And then again, later on, for every European got killed, 10 Indians got killed. They got a little less, but still, 10 times as much, right? The Indians, though few in number, put the government to immense expense of blood and treasure in the war from 1756 to 1791. What war? See, these are the wars they don't tell us about. The following campaigns in the Western country will be a proof of this. General Braddock's in the year 1755, Colonel Armstrong's against the Chattooga town on the Allegheny in 1757, General Forbes in 1758, General Stanwix in 1759, General Monckton's in 1760, Colonel Bouquet's in 1761, and again in 1763 when he fought the Battle of Brushy Run and lost above 100 men, but by taking the advice and assistance of the Virginia volunteers, finally drove the Indians. Who are these Virginia volunteers? Who's volunteering? Who's these auxiliaries? Where are they coming from? Could a lot of them be black Europeans? Yes, finally drove the Indians. Colonel Armstrong's up the west branch of the Susquehanna in the same year, General Broadstreet's up Lake Erie in 1764, Colonel Bouquet's at Muskingum at the same time, Lord Dunmore's in 1774. Look at all these little wars. These they're doing on the Indians right here. McIntosh's in 1778, and again in 1780. Colonel Bowman's in 1779, General Clark's in 1782, and against the Wabash Indians in 1786. General Logan's against the Shawnees in the same year, Colonel Hammer's in 1790, General Wilkinson's in 1791, General St. Clair's in 1791, and General Wayne's in 1794, which in all are 23 campaigns, besides smaller expeditions such as the French Creek expedition. Colonel Edwards, Lawries, etc. All these were exclusive of the numbers of men who were internally employed as scouting parties and erecting forts and guarding stations. All these black Europeans, huh? So they're pointing out a lot of these massacres. Really, they were worse because they didn't even give a lot of opportunity to the Indians. It was very unfair. They're more like massacres and invasions, relocations, murder, enslavements, maybe genocide. So all these wars in the 1700s, right? Right when America's supposedly getting her independence, right? Revolutionary War times, right? This is when they're also getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and George Washington creating his, right, his United States, the 13 colonies and all that. So while they're setting up shop and getting their freedom, they're over here massacring, getting rid of Indians. This is what I'm saying. What is happening to the Indians during all this time? Look at all these little wars that they never teach us about, really, or specify. They kind of sugarcoat when we're in history class. When we take the foregoing account into consideration, may we not reasonably conclude that the Indians are the best disciplined troops in the world? Huh? That's true, especially when we consider that the ammunition and arms that they are obliged to use are of the worst sort, without bayonets or cartouche boxes, no artificial means of carrying either baggage or provisions, while their enemies have every warlike implement and other resources to the utmost of their desire. All right, sort of like what the Palestinians go through now, right? They're going up against this technologically advanced, well-funded, rich government that has so many weapons to kill them and so much funding, and the Palestinians have nothing. So this is like what was happening to the Indians. So like we know, what's happening today in the world, it has happened in the Americas, guys. This is what we're trying to point out here. It is not the best discipline that has the greatest tendency to annoy an enemy and save their own men. It is apprehended that the Indian discipline is better calculated to answer their purpose in the woods of America than the British discipline in the plains of Flanders. British discipline in the woods is the way to have men slaughtered, with scarcely any chance to defend themselves. Privates. The Indians sum up their art of war thus. The business of the private warrior is to be under command, or punctually to obey orders, to learn to march abreast in scattered order, so as to be in readiness to surround the enemy or to prevent being surrounded, to be a good marksman and active in the use of their musket or rifle, musket, to practice running, to learn to endure hunger or hardships with patience and fortitude, to tell the truth at all times to their officers, more especially when sent out to spy the enemy. Continuing, it says here concerning officers, they say that it would be absurd to appoint a man to an office whose skill courage had never been tried, that all officers should be advanced only according to merit, that no single man should have the absolute command of an army, that a council of officers should determine when and how an attack is made, that it is the duty of officers to lay plans and take every advantage of the enemy, to ambush and surprise them, and to prevent the like to themselves. It is the duty of officers to prepare and deliver speeches to the men in order to animate and encourage them, and on a march to prevent the men at any time getting into a huddle, because if the enemy should surround them in that position, they would be greatly exposed. So the enemy's fire. It is likewise their business at all times to endeavor to annoy the enemy and save their own men, and therefore ought never to bring on an attack without considerable advantage, or without what appeared to them to ensure victory, and that with a loss of but few men, and if at any time they should be mistaken in this, and are likely to lose many men in gaining the victory, it is their duty to retreat and wait for a better opportunity of defeating their enemy, without the danger of losing so many men. Their conduct proves that they act on these principles. This is the statement given by those who are experimentally acquainted with them. And as long as the British officers despised both Indians and Americans who studied their art of war and formed themselves on the same plan, they were constantly beaten by those soldiers of nature, though seldom 1/4 of the number of the British, Even though they had less men, the Indians would always, a lot of the time, had more advantage and win these little wars or battles. But the British officers had one advantage of them. This was the art of drawing up and reporting to their superiors plans of their battles and exaggerated accounts of their great success and the immense loss of the Indians, which were never thought of till long after the battle was over, and often while they were smarting under their severe defeat or surprise. When the Indians determine on war or hunting, they have stated preparatory religious ceremonies for purification, particularly by fasting, as the Israelites did. They fast before war. Remember, we've gone over all these little things they do before war, just like the Israelites did. Like, we've gone over so much examples of how they acted like the ancient biblical Israelites acted in times of war, death, famine, whatever type of situation. The Indians kind of mimic that. So this is what they're saying. These must be the lost tribes. So again, purification before war, ceremonies, preparing, just like fasting, just like the Israelites did. Father Charleville gives an account of this custom in his time. In case of an intention of going to war, he who is to command does not commence the raising of soldiers till he has fasted several days, during which he is smeared with black, has no conversation with anyone, invokes by day and night his tutelar spirit, and above all is very careful to observe his dreams, all right? Talking to the Most High, Hawa, before war, man. Conversating, invoking Hawa, and listening and observing his dreams. The fast being over, he assembles his friends, and with a string of wampum in his hands, he speaks to them after this manner. Brethren, the Great Spirit authorizes my sentiments and inspires me with what I ought to do. The blood of is not wiped away, his body is not covered, and I will acquit myself of his duty towards him. Mr. Mackenzie in some measure confirms his account, though among different nations. If the tribes feel themselves called upon to go to war, the elders convene the people in order to obtain the general opinion. If it be for war, the chief publishes his intention to smoke in the sacred stem, a pipe, at a certain time. To this solemnity, mediation and fasting, or meditation or mediation and fasting are required as preparatory ceremonials. When the people are thus assembled and the meeting sanctified by the custom of smoking, right? They be smoking it up before they go to war. This may be an imitation of the smoke of the incense offered on the altar of the Jews, just like the Israelites. The chief enlarges on the causes which have called them together and the necessity of the measures proposed on the occasion. He then invites them who are willing to follow him to smoke out of the sacred stand, which is considered as a token of enrollment. A sacred feast then takes place, and after much ceremony usual on such occasion, the chief, turning to the east, makes a speech to explain more fully the design of their meeting, then concludes with an acknowledgement for past mercies received and a prayer for the continuance of them from the Master of Life. He then sits down, and the whole company declared their approbation and thanks for uttering the word "ho." Remember, in a very hoarse, guttural sound, "ho," being the third syllable of the beloved name, Jehovah. Remember, this is part of the Jehovah that they were doing, with an emphatic promulgation of the last letter. The chief then takes up the pipe and holds it to the mouth of the officiating person, like a priest of the Jews, just like the Israelites, with the incense. Guys, listen, all right? We're getting accounts from an Indian himself and other people we haven't heard from. We haven't quoted all these people he's quoting here. We haven't read from these people, but they were saying the same thing that we have already read in other accounts from other people. They are like the Israelites. They do everything just like the ancient Israelites or the biblical people, who after smoking 3 whiffs utters a short prayer and then goes round with it from east to west to every person present, passing the pipe around. The ceremony then being ended, he returns the company, thanks for their attendance, and wishes them, as well as the whole tribe, health and long life. Do not these practices remind the reader of the many directions in the Israelitish or Israelite ritual? commanding the strict purification or sanctifying individuals about to undertake great business or enter on important offices. The Indians, by oppression, diseases, wars, and ardent spirits, have greatly diminished in numbers, degenerated in their moral character, and lost their high standing as warriors, especially those contiguous to our settlements. The very ancient men who have witnessed the former glory and prosperity of their country, or who have heard from the mouths of their ancestors, and particularly from their beloved men, whose office it is to repeat their traditions and laws to the rising generations with the heroic achievements of their forefathers, the former state of their country, with the great prowess and success of their warriors of old times. They weep like infants when they speak of the fallen condition of their nations. They derive, however, some consolation from a prophecy of ancient origin, a prophecy, a promise, and universal currency among them, that the men of America will, at some future period, regain their ancient ascendancy and expel the man of Europe from this Western hemisphere. You guys hear that? He says one day the prophecy will be fulfilled, where they will be reestablished again. The men of America, the Amarucans. This flattering and consolatory persuasion has enabled the Seneca and Shawnese prophets to arrest in some tribes the use of intoxicating liquors, and has given birth at different periods to attempts for a general confederacy of the Indians of North America. Says here Clinton. The compiler of the Star in the West was present at a dinner given by General Knox to a number of Indians in the year 1789 at New York. They had come to the president on a mission from their nations. All right, so remember, we have read this book he's referencing, The Star in the West, where literally the author is trying to prove the Indians are the ancient Israelites. We've read that book, guys, remember. All right, I think we're done with it. If not, we should be almost done with it. You know, I'll definitely verify and make sure. If not, we'll come right back to that book too. But he's saying here that these Indians, the Seneca and Shawnees, right, they had come to the president, or just number of Indians, he didn't say which one, sorry. In 1789, the house was in Broadway. A little before dinner, 2 or 3 of the Sakims with their chief or principal man went into the balcony at the front of the house, the drawing room being upstairs. From this they had a view of the city, the harbor, Long Island, etc. After remaining there a short time, they returned into the room apparently dejected. But the chief, more than the rest, General Knox, took notice of it and said to him, "Brother, what has happened to you? You look sorry. Is there anything to distress you?" He answered, "I tell you, brother, I have been looking at your beautiful city, the great water, your fine country, and see how happy you all are. But then I could not help thinking that this fine country and this great water was once ours." Wow. Our ancestors lived here. They enjoyed it as their own in peace. It was a gift of the Great Spirit to them and their children. At last, the European people came here in a great canoe. They asked only to let them tie it to a tree, lest the water should carry it away. We consented. They then said some of their people were sick, and they asked permission to land them and put them under the shade of the trees. The ice then came, and they could not go away. They then begged a piece of land to build wigwams for the winter. We granted it to them. They then asked for some corn to keep them from starving. We kindly furnished it to them. They promised them to go away when the ice was gone. When this happened, we told them they must now go away with their big canoe. But they pointed to their big guns around their wigwams and said they would stay there, and we could not make them go away. Afterwards, more came. They brought spirituous and intoxicating liquors with them, of which the Indians became very fond. They persuaded us to sell them some land. Finally, they drove us back from time to time into the wilderness, far from the water and the fish and the oysters. They have destroyed the game. Our people have wasted away, and now we live miserable and wretched while you are enjoying our fine and beautiful country. This makes me sorry, brother, and I cannot help it. So he asked him, what's wrong? And he told him what's wrong. He's like, y'all came and took over everything. We trusted you. We were good to you guys, and y'all betrayed us. That's what's wrong with me. I can't help it. From the great similarity of the manners and customs of the Indian natives and those recorded of the Israelites, come on now, guys, of the Israelites, many learned men have come to the conclusion that the Indian tribes are none other than the descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Judah. Okay? Let's just go and highlight that. Oh, we can't highlight in this one. But you guys see, right? Many learned men, many people who are seen as scholars and respected said the same thing. If not, in what manner can we account for this similarity? Their religious emblems are nearly of the same import. Their rites and ceremonies in many respects do not differ essentially, right? This is from the Israelites. There is an evident approach in many instances between the two languages. Even the language, right? Hebrew and withal, there is a personal resemblance. They even look like them. The late William Penn, who was acquainted with the natives before they became corrupted by the Europeans, was exceedingly struck with their appearance. And in one of his letters to a friend in England, he says, I found them with like countenance with the Jewish race, and their children of so lively a resemblance to them, that a man would think himself in Duke's Place at Berry Street in London when he sees them. So what William Penn was saying, we've gone over this quote before many times, is that when he was in the Americas, he saw the children playing, he saw the people interactions, how they live. He says you would literally think you're in the Sephardic Jewish neighborhood of Duke's Place on Berry Street in London. Literally is what he's saying, guys. Doing the same things just like the Jews of London or the Sephardic Jews, the crypto Jews who were there. Penn's works, second volume, 80 page, year 1682 when he wrote that. 1682 when he said they're like the Jews, like the so-called Jewish or Israelite people. They're just like the Israelites. He wrote that in 1682. William Penn, guys, this is real history. Nobody's trying to make anybody anything. This is real history. I'm trying to read this to you guys so you guys can see how many different accounts we have. These books, they never showed us. This is a primary source from an Indian, a Pequot Indian, so-called black Indian. Remember, he's supposed to be mixed with African. You guys, I understand, man. We're hearing it from the horse's mouth. They wore earrings and nose jewels, bracelets on their arms and legs, rings on their fingers. Listen, necklaces made of highly polished shells found in their rivers and on their coast. Their females tied up their hair behind, worked bands around their head, and ornamented them with shells and feathers, and are fond of strings of beads around several parts of their bodies. They use shells and turkey spurs around the tops of their moccasins to twinkle like little bells as they walk. Wow, just like the Israelites. Isaiah proves this to have been the custom of the Jewish women, of the Israelite women, just like Isaiah wrote in the Bible. The women were dressed just like the Indian women, guys. Pay attention, listen, or something much like it. In that day, says the prophet Isaiah, right? The Most High, Hawa, will take away the bravery of their twinkling ornaments about their feet, and their cauls and their round tires like the moon, the chains and the bracelets and the mufflers, the bonnets and the ornaments of the legs, and the headbands and the tablets and the earrings, the rings and the nose jewels. Isaiah 3:18. They religiously observed certain feasts very similar to those enjoyed on the Hebrews by Moses. All right, even the feasts, the ceremonies, the green corn fest, all that, guys, all that is part of these biblical traditions that the Indians still practice, or supposedly practice. And now today is more like a commercialized, version. They don't even know the origin, right? So they're doing this feast just like the Hebrews by Moses, as we'll hereinafter more particularly be shown. In short, many, and indeed it may be said, most of the learned men who did pay any particular attention to these natives of the wilderness at their first coming among them, both English and Spaniards, right? So-called English, so-called Spaniards, were struck with their general likeness to the Israelites, so-called Jews, to the Israelites, Anybody who actually paid attention to them, who actually lived with them, who actually talked to them, who actually met with them and got to know them, not just killed them, right? Said, man, they're just like the Israelites. They're just like the Israelites, guys. Pay attention, real history. This is your ancestors they talking about, real biblical people, real biblical lands, the true old world. This is what they were writing about. Things they didn't show us in school. They want us to think savage, savage, savage. They want us to picture a certain type of Indian, right? The Indians in New Jersey about 1681. Listen, are described as persons straight in their limbs, beyond the usual proportion of most nations, very seldom crooked or deformed, their features regular, their countenance somewhat fierce, and common rather resembling a Jew, an Israelite, than a Christian, resembling more of a Jew than a Christian. That's from Smith's History of New Jersey, okay? Smith's History of New Jersey, 1681. They look like a Jew. They look like an Israelite more than a Christian, all right? We're getting primary sources here. In general, the Indian languages are very copious and expressive, considering the narrow sphere in which they move. In comparison with civilized nations, their ideas are few. In their language, we find neither cases or declensions, and few or no prepositions. This has been remarked more particularly as there is no language known in Europe except the Hebrew, without prepositions. Just like the Hebrew, huh? Just like William Penn said, and many others wrote about. The public speeches of the Indians are short but bold, nervous, and abounding with metaphor. For instance, the speech made by Logan, a famous Indian chief, about the year 1775 was never exceeded by Demosthenes or Cicero. All right, it was even greater than these famous oral speakers, right, of ancient Greece or Rome. In revenge for a murder committed by some unknown Indians, a party of our people fired on a canoe loaded with women and children, and one man, all of whom happened to belong to the family of Logan, who had been long the staunch friend of the Americans and then at perfect peace with them. So even this guy who was very peaceful and friends with the Europeans, experienced some atrocities in his family. Eventually, they see what they did. They shot at his people, right, shooting women and children. After he had been all nice to them. A war immediately ensued, and after much bloodshed on both sides, the Indians were beat and sued for peace. A treaty was held, but Logan disdainfully refused to be reckoned among the suppliants. But to prevent any disadvantage from his absence to his nation, he sent the following talk to be delivered to Lord Dunmore at the treaty. This is what he said to Lord Dunmore, right? The Indian, the copper-colored Indian. He says, I appeal to any European man to say, if he ever entered Logan's cabin hungry, and he gave him not meat, if ever he came cold and naked, and Logan clothed him not, during the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin, an advocate for peace. Such was his love for the European men, that my countrymen pointed as they passed, and said, Logan is the friend of the European man, or white man, right? I had thought to have lived with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel, the last spring in cold blood, and unprovoked murdered all the relations of Logan, not sparing even my women and children. There runs not a drop of his blood in the veins of any living creature. This calls on me for revenge. I have sought it. I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance for my country. I rejoice at the beams of peace, but do not harbor a thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. Who is there to mourn for Logan? No, not one. Great allowance must be made for translations into another language, especially by illiterate and ignorant interpreters. This destroys the force as well as beauty of the original. A writer, Adair, right? James Adair. Remember, we read James Adair's book. He lived with the Southeast Indians for 40 years. He married a Choctaw wife. He literally wrote a book, the history of the North American Indians, right? Something like that. I forget. You guys know I read it. Check out my James Adair videos. Literally, the whole book is written to prove that, again, the Indians are the ancient Hebrews or Israelites. Yeah, literally the whole book. Somebody who lived with them for 40 years and married a Choctaw woman. He knew them. So it says a writer, Adair, who has had the best opportunities to know the true idiom of their language by a residence among them for 40 years, has taken great pains to show the similarity of the Hebrew with the Indian languages, both in their roots and general construction, and insists that many of the Indian words to this day are purely Hebrew, notwithstanding their exposure to the loss of it to such a degree as to make the preservation of it so far little less than miraculous. Mr. Bodynut, in his able work, states, as a matter of curiosity, that the Mohawks, in confederacy with the Five Nations, as subsisting at the first arrival of the Europeans in America, were considered as the lawgivers or the interpreters of duty to the other tribes. Nay, this was so great that all paid obedience to their advice. They considered themselves as supreme or first among the rest. Mr. Colden says that he had been told by old men in New England that when their Indians were at war formerly with the Mohawks, as soon as one appeared, the Indians raised a cry from hill to hill, a Mohawk, upon which all fled like sheep before a wolf, without attempting to make the least resistance, and that all the nations around them have for many years entirely submitted to their advice and paid them a yearly tribute of wampum. The tributary nations dare not make war or peace without the consent of the Mohawks. Mr. Colden has given a speech of the Mohawks in answer to one from the governor of Virginia, complaining of the Confederate nations, which shows the Mohawks' superiority over them, and the mode in which they corrected their misdoings. Now it seems very remarkable that the Hebrew word Mohawk, oh, that's what he's saying, Mohawk, huh? Spelled so much like the Indian word, means a lawgiver, or leges interpreters, or a superior. The judges? Danites, maybe? A lawgiver, huh? A priest king, like Moses. So Mohawk, literally means lawgiver, guys. Almost the word Mohawk is what he's saying. Blind chance could not have directed so great a number of remote and warring savage nations to fix on and unite in so nice a religious standard of speech and even grammatical construction of language where there was no knowledge of letters or syntax. For instance, A, O, O, E, A is a strong religious Indian emblem, signifying I climbed, ascend, or remove to another place of residence. It points to Anowa, the first person, singular, Oewa, or Jahwa. You guys see, we can't make this up, guys. Aowa, Awa, Oewa, or Jahwa, Hawa. You guys see that? Hawa. You guys think I'm just be making things up in sounds and words, right? Shout out to Drop. Shout out to Drop Nation. Shout out to Con Drop for bringing us to Hawa, helping us remember Hawa. You see what he's telling you and showing you here, just like many other people wrote this, guys. Remember, this is from the early 1800s, almost 1700s. He's writing this. The first person singular, Oya, or Yahweh, Yahweh, mighty Hawa, and implies putting themselves under the divine patronage, protection of the Most High. The beginning of that most sacred symbol is by studious skill and thorough knowledge of the power of letters, placed twice, to prevent them from being applied to the sacred name for vain purposes or created things. Though they lost the true meaning of their religious emblems, except what a very few of the more intelligent traders revive in their retentive memories of the old inquisitive magi or beloved man, yet tradition directs them to apply them properly. They use many plain religious emblems of the divine name as Yo, Hewa, like Yo, Hawa, Hawa, Ja and Ale, Alleluia, Ale, Halal, Hawa. And these are the roots of the prodigious number of words through their various dialects. Hawa. It is worthy of remembrance that two Indians who belonged to far distant nations without the knowledge of each other's language except from the general idiom, will intelligibly converse together and contract engagements without any interpreter, in such a surprising manner as is scarcely credible. In like manner, we read of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob traveling from country to country, from Chaldea into Palestine, from Ireland into Palestine, which is the real Palestine, is the one they show us today, when inhabited by various different nations. So, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob spoke to other nations. They were able to understand other people. They speak in the ancient mother tongue. Thence into Egypt, so-called Egypt, America, ancient Egypt was in America, and back again, making engagements and treating with citizens wherever they went. But we never read of any difficulty of being understood or they're using an interpreter. That's true, guys. Like, pay attention to that. Like in the Bible, you got all these different nations that supposedly speak different languages or different people, yet when they're in the Bible, they're so associating with each other, they're talking to each other. There's no mention of them, oh, they couldn't understand their language, or they couldn't understand each other, or they spoke different languages. That's a big one right there. That's something to think about, right? The Indians generally expressing themselves with great vehemence and short pauses in their public speeches. Their periods are well turned and very sonorous and harmonious. Their words are specially chosen and well disposed, with great care and knowledge of their subject and language, to show the being, power, and agency of the Great Spirit in all that concerns them. To speak in general terms, the language in their roots, idiom, and particular construction appears to have the whole genius of the Hebrew, okay? Of the Hebrew. Their whole roots, the idiom, the construction, they have the genius of the Hebrew, okay? They're speaking Hebrew. They have some of the mother tongue still. And what is very remarkable and well worthy of serious observation as most of the peculiarities of that language, especially those in which it differs from most other languages, and often both in letters and signification, synonymous with the Hebrew language. Okay? They call the lightning and thunder Eloha, and its rumbling noise Rawah, Rawah, which may not improperly be deduced from the Hebrew word Ruach, Ruach, Rawah, Ruach, the Spirit, a name of the third person in the Holy Trinity, originally signifying the air in motion or a rushing wind. Fiber, we're talking about the Spirit, the Ruach, your soul, Spirit of the Most High in you. The Indian compounded words are generally pretty long, but those that are radical or simple are mostly short. Very few, if any of them, exceed 3 or 4 syllables, and as their dialects are guttural, every word contains some consonants, and these are the essential characteristics of language, or languages, right? Where they deviate from this rule, it is by the religious emblems, which obviously proceeds from the great regard they pay to the names of the deity, especially to the great 4-letter divine, essential name, by using the letters it contains and the vowels it was originally pronounced with, to convey a virtuous idea, or by doubling or transposing them to signify the contrary. And this all the Indian nations agree. And as this general custom must proceed from one primary cause, it seems to assure us that this people was not in a savage state when they first separated and varied their dialects with so much religious care and exact art. Mr. Boudinot, speaking of the Indian traditions as received by their nation, says, not having the assistance afforded by the means of writing and reading, they are obliged to have recourse to tradition, as Dupratz on volume 2, page 169 says, has justly observed, to preserve the resemblance or the remembrance of remarkable transactions or historical facts, and this tradition cannot be preserved but by frequent repetitions. Consequently, many of their young men are often employed in hearkening to the old beloved men, narrating the history of their ancestors, which is thus transmitted from generation to generation. In order to preserve them pure and incorrupt, they are careful not to deliver them indifferently to all their young people, but only to those young men of whom they have the best opinion. They hold it as a certain fact as delivered down from their ancestors that their forefathers, in very remote ages, came from a far distant country by the way of the west, where all the people were of one color, one color, And that in process of time, they moved eastward to their present settlements. Are we going to say, oh, they mean pale skin? Come on, when we know all the original people and most ancient people were melanated. So if they were one color, we're talking about melanated, different shades, couple colored tribes. They moved to their present settlements. This tradition is corroborated by a current report among them, related by the old Chickasaw Indians to our traders, and now about 100 years ago, there came from Mexico or Mexica some of the old Chickasaw Nation. They came from Mexico or some of the Mexicas specifically, the original Mexicas, some of the old Chickasaw Nation. Remember that a lot of the Muscogee speaking tribes are coming from Mexico, guys. This is their migration story, okay? Or as the Spaniards called them, Chichimecas, the Chichimecas. That's the Chickasaw guys. The Chichimecas, when you're reading about them in ancient Mexico, those are the ancestors of the Chickasaw. Okay, same people. In quest of their brethren, as far north as the Aquapa Nation, Aquapa, above 130 miles above the Natchez, on the southeast side of the Mississippi River. But through French policy, they were either killed or sent back so as to prevent their opening a brotherly intercourse with them as they had proposed. It is also said that the Nautalcas believed that they dwelt in another region before they settled in Mexico, that their forefathers wandered 80 years in search of it through a strict obedience to the commands of the Great Spirit, who ordered them to go in quest of new lands, right? Of promised lands following the Most High, that had such particular marks as were made known to them, and they punctually obeyed the divine mandate, and by that means found out and settled that fertile country of Mexico, right? Or Anahuac. Our southern Indians have also a tradition among them which they firmly believe that of old time their ancestors lived beyond the great river, that 9 parts of their nation out of 10 passed over the river, but the remainder refused and stayed behind. The Euphrates, the original Euphrates, that they had a king when they lived far to the west who left 2 sons, that one of them with a number of his people traveled a great way for many years till they came to the Delaware River and settled there. Tambalinapi maybe? That some years ago the king of the country from which they had emigrated sent a party in search of them. This was at the time the French were in possession of the country on the river Allegheny. That after seeking 6 years, they found an Indian who led them to the Delaware towns where they stayed 1 year. That the French sent a European man with them on their return to bring back an account of their country, but they have never been heard of since. It is said among their principal or beloved men that they have it handed down from their ancestors that the book which the white people or European people once was once theirs. So when the Europeans, right, came with their Bibles, right, even though the very first Bible in the Americas, which was mostly the New Testament, was translated, was made in actually in the Ojibwe Algonquin language by Mr. Eliot. I believe his name was John Eliot, I believe. And if I remember correctly, right? So they're saying that when they showed them the Bible, right? They showed the Indians the Bible. The Indians say, "Hey, that's our book, man. Those are our stories. What are you talking about?" He said that the book which the European people have was once theirs. That while they had it, they prospered exceedingly, but that the European people bought it off them, and learned many things from it, while the Indians lost their credit, offended the Great Spirit, and suffered exceedingly from the neighboring nations. You see, so Deuteronomy 28, you got punished. Now another nation has your story. Now they have a Bible. Now they talk about it. Now they act like they're the ones in the Bible, or they were the ones that they were being talked about. That the Great Spirit took pity on them and directed them to this country. Yep, Deuteronomy 28, Most High allowed them to come. That on their way they came to a great river which they could not pass, when God dried up the waters and they passed over dry shod. Look at that. Just like the Exodus, the Indians telling, the story of the Exodus, the river drying up and all that. They also say that their forefathers were possessed of an extraordinary divine spirit by which they foretold future events and controlled the common course of nature. And this they transmitted to their offspring on condition of their obeying the sacred laws. Come on now, follow the commandments. The Indians, these are their oral traditions, guys. They were passed down to the younger generations of the biblical days, right? Their ancient days. But that this power for a long time past had entirely ceased. What happened to that power you had? The Reverend gentleman mentioned before, who had taken so much pains in the year 1764 or 65 to travel far westward to find Indians who had never seen a European man, informed the writer of these memoirs that far to the northwest of the Ohio, he attended a party of Indians to a treaty with Indians from the west of the Mississippi. Here he found the people he was in search of. He conversed with their beloved man who had never seen a European man before by the assistance of the three grades of interpreters. The Indian informed him that one of their ancient traditions was that a great while ago they had a common father who lived towards the rising of the sun and governed the whole world, that all the European people's heads were under his feet, that he had 12 sons by whom he administered his government, that his authority was derived from the Great Spirit by virtue of some special gift from him. You know, he's literally describing Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. He's saying, a lot of you Europeans, you coming from Jacob too. Listen to what he's saying. That the 12 sons behaved very bad and tyrannized over the people, abusing their power to a great degree so as to offend the Great Spirit exceedingly. You see, they messed up, they fell off, and what happened? The Great Spirit, Hawaii, punished them, right? Deuteronomy 28. This is their tradition. This is their oral story, telling it in a different way, right? That he, being thus angry with them, suffered the European people to introduce spirituous liquors among them, made them drunk, stole the special gift of the Great Spirit from them, and by this means usurped the power over them. And ever since, the Indians' heads were under the European people's feet. That's literally, it's like reading Deuteronomy 28, the curses of what would happen, right? But that they also had a tradition that the time would come when the Indian would regain the gift of the Great Spirit from the European people, and with it their ancient power, when the European people's heads would be again under the Indians' feet. All right, the roles are going to reverse soon, guys. It's a promise. When we start keeping the code again, when we remember who we really are, start keeping the code. It's already been promised. It shall come to pass, guys. Most High don't play. Hawa. Mr. Mackenzie, in his history of the fur trade and his journey through North America by the lakes to the South Sea and the year, and they don't have the year, says that the Indians informed him that they had a tradition among them, that they originally came from another country inhabited by wicked people and had traversed the Great Lake, which was a narrow, shallow, and full of islands, where they had suffered great hardships and much misery, it being always winter, with ice and deep snows at a place they called the Copper Mine River. Copper Mine River, talking about the Great Lakes, copper, where they made the first land. The ground was covered with copper, over which a body of earth had since been collected to the depths of a man's height. Wow. So it's gotta be the Great Lakes region, you know, when they settled there, right? And they came. They believe also that in ancient times their ancestors had lived till their feet were worn out with walking and their throats with eating. Wow, from the journey and migration, right? So why do I say I have to be the Great Lakes region? Remember, the richest and purest copper in the world is from the Michigan area around there, the Great Lakes area, and they have found an ancient mine missing 500,000 tons of copper. They don't know where it went, guys. This is the same copper that helped create the Bronze Age, literally. Okay? That's what I'm talking about. They believe also that in ancient times, their ancestors had lived till their feet were worn out with walking and their throats were eaten. They described the deluge, when the water spread over the whole earth, except the highest mountain, on the top of which they were preserved. You see, so not everybody, this is what I was saying the other day in another video, there's a lot of stories from the ancient people that, you know, match the biblical flood, but sometimes they'll tell you they didn't get on a boat. They actually went up a mountain. That's how they were able to survive the flood. And that really did happen, guys. Not everybody got on the boat or ark. They also believe in a future judgment. Mackenzie, history page 113. So Mackenzie, another person wrote that, I believe that was in the 1700s. He's letting us know. See how many different primary sources he's quoting here, right? William Apes. Mackenzie's agreeing. Yeah, man, they got all the biblical traditions, man. The Indians to the eastward say that previous to the European people coming into the country, their ancestors were in the habit of using circumcision, right? They circumcised, but latterly Not being able to assign any reason for so strange a practice, their young people insisted on its being abolished. You guys hear that? So they had a tradition of circumcising their young and their people, and eventually, so many years went by, they forgot who they were, they forgot their traditions, they were only doing them, and they didn't even know why. So they were like, "Why are we doing this? Why are we cutting ourselves with our penises? Why are we doing? Let's just stop doing it." They couldn't even remember why they even started that. Remember why people were doing that, right? So they insisted on its being abolished. They stopped doing it. Mackenzie says the same of the Indians he saw on his route, even at this day. History, page 34, speaking of the nations of the slave and dog rib Indians, very far to the northwest, he says, whether circumcision be practiced among them, I cannot pretend to say, but the appearance of it was general among those I saw. He said, "Hey, I don't know if they were circumcised and they haven't told me, but hey, I saw it and they were circumcised." I saw it. The dog rib Indians live about 200 or 300 miles from the straits of Kamchatka. Dog rib Indians, huh? Kamchatka. Dr. Betty says in his journal of a visit he paid to the Indians on the Ohio about 50 years ago that an old Christian Indian informed him that an old uncle of his who died about the year 1728 related to him several customs and traditions of former times, and among others, that circumcision was practiced among the Indians long ago, but their young men make it a mock of it, or mock at it, brought it into disrepute. And so it came to be disused. You see, the young people were like, "Nah, we ain't doing that anymore. I don't care why y'all do it. I don't care about the most. I'm not scared." Journal, page 89. The same Indians said that one tradition they had was that once the waters had overflowed all the land and drowned all the people, then living except a few who made a great canoe and were saved in it. All right, page 90. So this is what Mackenzie's going over. We got to get in Betty's book. All right, Dr. Betty. I think we have read Dr. Betty's book too. We've quoted all these people in other videos, guys. Like we've read more of their book, so you guys can know. But we're getting it all in one drop today. All right, he said, hey, they had the tradition of the flood and the ark, and that a long time ago the people went to build a high place. That while they were building of it, they lost their language and could not understand one another. It's like the story of the Tower of Babel. This is also an old tradition of the American Indians, guys. All these biblical stories. This is what the Europeans encountered when they got here. That while one perhaps called for a stick, another brought him a stone. And from that time, the Indians began to speak different languages. Father Charlevoix, the French historian, informs us that the Hurons and Iroquois, in that early day, had a tradition among them that the first woman came from heaven, and that had twins, and that the elder killed the younger. Wow, that's literally the story of Cain and Abel. In an account published in the year 1644 by a Dutch minister of the gospel in New York, giving an account of the Mohawks, he says, an old woman came to my house and told the family that her forefathers had told her that the Great Spirit once went out walking with his brother, and that a dispute arose between them, and the Great Spirit killed his brother. This is plainly a confusion of the story of Cain and Abel. It is most likely from the ignorance of the minister in the idiom of the Indian language, misconstruing Cain being represented a great man for the Great Spirit. Many mistakes of this kind are frequently made. Mr. Adair, again back with James Adair. Remember, he lived with the Indians for 40 years, married to Chuck the wife, who has written the history of the Indians. We read almost literally a lot of that book, like a lot, and who deserves great credit for his industry and improving the very great and uncommon opportunities he enjoyed, tells us that the Southern Indians have a tradition, listen, that when they left their own native land, they brought with them a sanctified rod or a staff, right? The staff that they were placing on the ground, and the Most High will tell them where to go, right? So they have this staff by order of an oracle, which they fixed every night in the ground and were to remove from place to place on this continent towards the rising sun till it budded in one night's time. That they obeyed the sacred oracle, and the miracle at last took place after they arrived on the side of the Mississippi. This is their migration story of the Creeks and the Muskogee people, guys. On the present land they possess. This was the sole cause of their settling there, of fighting so firmly for the reputed holy land and holy things, that they may be buried with their beloved forefathers. Again, to the Southeast Indians, that is their holy land. That is their promised land. It never stopped. Once they got to one promised land, Most High, things happened, and then they would have to relocate, and Most High gave them another promised land. And that's when they ended up in Mississippi, these people from Mexico. This seems to be taken in his journal. Sorry. This seems to be taken from Aaron's Rod, right? Aaron's Rod. Just like Aaron's Rod. Colonel James Smith in his journal of events that happened while he was prisoner with the Kauniwaga Indians from 1755 to 1759 says, they have a tradition that in the beginning of this continent, the angels or heavenly inhabitants, right, the dracons, the dragons, the so-called angels, as they call them, frequently visited the people. Listen, this is when they were able to talk and see dragons. Listen, so these angels, so-called angels, he's saying, right, the Indians are telling James Smith during his captivity that the dragons visited the people and talked with their forefathers. How can a dragon or an angel talk? Listen, and gave directions on how to pray and how to appease the great being when he was offended. They told them they were to offer sacrifice, burn tobacco, buffalo and deer's bones, etc. This is from page 79, guys, when the Indians talked to the dracons. The angels instructing dracons, Quetzalcoatl. Didn't Quetzalcoatl instruct people on how to do offerings to the Most High and live righteous and all that? It wasn't Quetzalcoatl a dracon or plum serpent, so-called angel. The author would say that there are two great beings that rule and govern the universe, who are at war with each other. The one they call Manero, and the other Mache Manero. They say that Manero is all kindness and love, and the other is an evil spirit that delights in doing mischief. Some say that they are equal in power. Others say that Manero is the first great cause, and therefore must be all powerful and supreme, and ought to be adored and worshipped, whereas Mache Manero ought to be rejected and despised. Some of the Wyandots and Kauniwagas profess to be Roman Catholics, but even these retain many of the notions of their ancestors. Those who reject the Roman Catholic religion hold that there is one great first cause, whom they call Owahio, Owahio, Owahia, Allahua, Yohua, Owahio, that rules and governs the universe and takes care of all his creatures, rational and irrational, and gives them their food in due season, and hears the prayers of all those who call upon him. Therefore, it is but just and reasonable to pray and offer sacrifice to this great being, and to do those things that are pleasing in his sight. But they widely differ in what is pleasing or displeasing to this great being. Some hold that following nature or their own propensities is the way to happiness. Others reject this opinion altogether and say that following their own propensities in this manner is neither the means of happiness or the way to please the deity. My friend Tanego said, our happiness depends on our using our reasons in order to suppress these evil dispositions. But when our propensities neither led us to injure ourselves nor others, we may with safety endorse them or even pursue them as the means of happiness. Page 86. Can any man, says Mr. Bodynut, read this short account of Indian traditions drawn from tribes of various nations, from the west to the east, like from so many different nations, right, in America, so many indigenous people, different stories, but listen, they get in different traditions, right? I mean, from different people, not different stories, but he's trying to make a point here, right? From the east to west and from the south to north, wholly separated from each other, written by different authors of the best character, both for knowledge and integrity, possessing the best means of information at various and distant times, without any possible communication with each other, and in one instance from ocular and sensible demonstration, written on the spot in several instances with the relators before them, and yet suppose that all this is either the effect of chance, accident, or design. They all had the same story, even though they're all different. They all got the same stories, guys. From a love of the marvelous or a premeditated intention of deceiving, and thereby ruining their own well-established reputations? He's asking, like, how could this all be a coincidence? Charleville was a clergyman of character who was with the Indians some years and traveled from Canada to the Mississippi in that early day. Adair lived 40 years entirely domesticated with the Southern Indians and was a man of learning and great observation. Just before the Revolutionary War, he brought his manuscript to Elizabethtown in New Jersey. Oh, I've been there. There's a lot of coast. That's one of the towns in the Americas and the States, right, that has the most Costa Ricans. Elizabethtown in New Jersey, right? So just wanted to mention that. Sorry. So he's talking about when he was there, James Adair. He brought a manuscript from there to Elizabethtown, from the south to Elizabethtown, New Jersey, to William Livingston, Esquire, a neighbor of the writer, to have it examined and corrected, which was prevented by the troubles of a political nature just breaking out. The Reverend Mr. Brainerd was a man of remarkable piety and a missionary with the Crossweek Indians to his death. Crossweek? I don't think I've ever heard that name. Dr. Edwards was eminent for his piety and learning and was intimately acquainted with the Indians from his youth. Dr. Betty. So he's basically pointing out who are these people he's quoting. These are people who actually knew the Indians, guys. These are primary sources who actually lived with them, talked with them, got to know them. That's why they're writing this. That's why they're saying these are biblical people. These are the real biblical people. So Dr. Betty was another one we've read from, right? Was a clergyman of note and established character. Bartram, that's another one we've read from, was a man well known to the writer and traveled the country to the Southern Indians as a botanist and was a man of considerable discernment and had great means of knowledge. And Mr. Mackenzie, in the employment of the Northwest Company, an old trader and the first adventurous explorer of the country from the Lake of the Woods to the Southern Ocean. All right, he's saying these aren't like just anybody. These are important people. They wouldn't just be making this up. All right, and he actually met a couple of them, as he's saying. It is now asked, continues Mr. Bodinut, can anyone carefully and with deep reflection consider and compare these traditions with the history of the 10 tribes of Israel and the late discoveries of the Russians, Captain Cook and others, in and about the peninsula of Kamchatka and the northeast coast of Asia and the opposite shores of America, of which little was before known by any civilized nation, without at least drawing strong presumptive inferences in favor of these wandering nations being descended from some oriental nation of the old world. All right, they are from the old world. These are the old world people, because America is the true old world. And most probably, all things considered, being the lost tribes of Israel. They are the lost tribes of Israel. They are the old world people. These are the biblical people. Look at how many books we read in the last 8 years, guys. All this history they didn't tell us about. You gotta have context. You gotta know who you are truly. Let us look into the late discoveries and compare them with the Indian traditions. Kamchatka is a large peninsula on the northeastern part of Asia. It is a mountainous country lying between 51 and 62 degrees of north latitude, and of course a very cold and frozen climate. No grain can be raised there, though some vegetables are. Skins and furs are their chief exports. The natives are wild as the country itself and live on fish and sea animals with their reindeer. The islands in this sea, which separated from the northwest coast of America, are so numerous that the existence of an almost continued chain of them between the two continents is now rendered extremely probable. The principal of them are the Kurile Islands, those called Barrens and Copper Islands, the Aleutian Islands and Fox Islands. Copper Island, which lies in 54 degrees north and in full sight of Barrens Island, has its name from the great quantities of copper which the northeast coast of it abounds. Northeast coast. Mr. Greaves' history, it is washed up by the sea and covers the shores in such an abundance that many ships might be loaded with it very easily. These islands are subject to continual earthquakes and abound in sulfur. Alaska is one of the most eastwardly islands and probably is not far from the American coast. So they're saying Alaska's an island, huh? In the 1800s. Listen, Alaska an island, huh? Probably not too far. He doesn't know. The snow lies on these islands till March, and the sea is filled with ice in winter. There is little or no wood growing in any part of the country, and the inhabitants live in holes during the earth. Their greatest delicacies are wild lily and other roots and berries with fish and other sea animals. The distance between the most northeasterly part of Asia and the northwest coast of America is determined by the famous navigator Captain Cook not to exceed 39 miles. These straits are often filled with ice, even in summer, and frozen in winter, and by that means might become a safe passage for that for the most numerous hosts to pass over in safety, though these continents had never been once joined, or at a much less distance than at present. So now they're going with, so now that he's trying to explain, somebody he's quoting, right? He's trying to explain how could these Hebrews or ancient Israelites have got into the Americas. So of course they're going to go with the Bering Strait theory. So they're just talking about maybe they came through here, maybe not knowing that America's a true old world. All right, so we got to dodge the hijack a little bit in this part. It says the sea from the south of Bering Strait to the islands between the two continents is very shallow. From the frequent volcanoes that are continually happening, it is probable not only that there has been a separation of the continent at Bering Strait, but that the whole space from the island to that small opening was once filled up by land. That was the land bridge, guys. Like there was more land connected from to Asia and the Americas. There was a lot of land, not just up there in Alaska, right? But that it had, by the force and fury of the waters, perhaps actuated by fire, been totally sunk and destroyed, and the islands left in its room. Don't. But the same was happening, with Northeast America and the British Isles or Europe. Same thing. There was a land bridge there, so it doesn't mean they were just coming from one area. Especially knowing this is a true old world, a lot of them were from here already. They were here from creation. So this is their theorizing right here, right? Neither it is improbable that the first passage of the sea was much smaller than at present, and that it was widening yearly, and perhaps many small islands that existed at the first separation of the continents have sunk or otherwise have been destroyed. These changes are manifest in almost every country. Monsieur Lepage Duprat, in his second volume of his History of Louisiana, page 120, informs us that being exceedingly desirous to be informed of the origin of the Indian natives, made every inquiry in his power, especially of the nation of the Natchez, one of the most intelligent among them. All he could learn from them was that they came from between the north and the sun setting. Being no way satisfied with this, he sought for one who bore the character of one of their wisest men. He was happy enough to discover one named Moniach Tape, or Monish Tape, among the Jasons, a nation about 40 leagues from the Natchez. This man was remarkable for his solid understanding and elevation of sentiment, and his name was given to him by his nation as expressive of the man, meaning killer of pain and fatigue. His eager desire was to see the country from whence his forefathers came. He obtained directions and set off. He went up the Missouri, so the river, right? He went up the Missouri, whence he stayed a long time to learn the different languages of the nations he was to pass through. After long traveling, he came to the nation of the Otters, and by them was directed on his way till he reached the Southern Ocean. After being some time with the nations on the shores of the Great Sea, he proposed to proceed on his journey and join himself to some people who inhabited more westerly on the coast. They traveled the great way between the north and the sun setting when they arrived at the village of his fellow travelers, where he found the days long and the nights short. He was here advised to give over all thoughts of continuing his journey. They told him that the land extended till a long way in the direction of aforesaid, after which it ran directly west, and at length was cut by the great water from the north to south. One of them added that when he was young, he knew a very old man who had seen that distant land before it was eat away by the great water, and when the great water was low, many rocks still appeared in those parts. Monashtape took their advice and returned home after an absence of 5 years. This account, given by Duprat in the year 1720, confirmed the idea of the narrow passage of Kamchatka and the probability that the continents once joined. Well, we know they did. It is remarkable that the people, especially the Kamchatkians, in their marches never go but in Indian file, following one another in the same track. Some of the nations in this quarter prick their flesh with small punctures with a needle in various shapes, then rub into them charcoal, blue liquid, or some other color, so as to make the marks to become indelible, after the manner of the more eastern nations. Bishop Loth, in his notes on the 16th verse of the 6th chapter, or the 6th chapter of Isaiah, says this is certainly an allusion to some practice common among the Jews at this time of making marks on their hands and arms by punctures on the skin, with some sort of sign or representation of the city or temple. to show their affection and zeal for it. They had a method of making such punctures indelible by fire or staining, and this is art, and this art is practiced by traveling Jews all over the world at this day. Also, his note on chapter it says fifth verse, so it says, thus it is with our northern Indians, they always go in Indian file and mark their flesh just as above represented. The writer of this has seen an aged Christian Indian Sakim of good character who sat for his portrait. On stripping his neck to the lower part of his breast, it appeared that the whole was marked with a deep bluish color and various figures, very discernible. On being asked the reason of it, he answered, with a heavy sigh, that it was one of the follies of his youth when he was a great warrior before his conversion to Christianity. And now says he, I must bear it as a punishment for my folly, and I carry the marks of it to my grave. The people of Siberia made canoes of birch bark, distended over ribs of wood, nicely sewed together. The writer has seen this exactly imitated by the Indians on the river of St. Lawrence, and it is universally the case on the lakes. Colonel John Smith says, at length we all embarked in a large birch bark canoe. This vessel was about 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, and about 35 feet long. That's pretty long. And though it could carry a heavy burden, it was so artfully and curiously constructed that 4 men could carry it several miles, from one landing place to another, or from the waters of the lakes to the waters of the Ohio. At night they carry it on the land and invert it, or turn it bottom up and convert it into a dwelling house. Wow. It also appears from the history of Kamchatka, written by James Grieve, that in the late discoveries, the islands which extend from the south point of Kamchatka amount to 31 or 32. That on these islands are high mountains, and many of them smoking volcanoes, that the passages between them, except in 1 or 2 instances, were but 1 or 2 days' row at the time of the author's writing that history. They are liable to terrible inundations and earthquakes. The following is collected from Mr. Steller's journal, as recorded in the above history. The mainland of America lies parallel with the coast of Kamchatka, insomuch that it may reasonably be concluded that these lands once joined, especially at the Teshukotskoi Nos, or Cape. He offers reasons to prove it. First, the appearance of both coasts, which appear to be torn asunder. Second, many capes project into the sea from 30 to 60 versts. Third, many islands are in the sea which divides Kamchatka from America. Fourth, the situation of the islands and the breadth of that sea. The sea is full of islands which extend from the northwest point of America to the channel of Ania Nova. Anion, New Anion, Anion, New Anion, Nova. Nova means new. New Anion, huh? That's the real Anion. Anion, shout out to Drop, yo. So again, they're trying to prove this whole Bering Strait. You know, they're trying to say maybe they came from here, maybe. Even though this is part of his history, they're telling you, yeah, we know that was connected. There was land bridges all over. There was more land connected to South America, to Central America. You know, even North America and some weren't connected. You know, at one point. So the land has changed a lot. That doesn't mean that they all came from there, right? You know, that's that whole Bering Strait theory. We got to dodge the hijack. Either way, let's keep reading. Because one follows another, as the Kodulowski Islands do at Japan. The American coast at 60 degrees of north latitude is covered with wood, but at Kamchatka, which is only 51 degrees, there is none for near 50 versts from the sea, and at 62 not one tree is to be found. It is known also that the fish enter the rivers on the American coast earlier than they do in the rivers of Kamchatka. There are also raspberries of a large size and fine taste, besides honeysuckles, cranberries, and blackberries in great plenty. In the sea there are seals, sea beavers, whales, and dogfish. In the country and in the rivers on the American coast, red and black foxes, swans, ducks, quails, plover, and 10 kinds of birds not known in Europe. These particulars may help to answer the question, whence was America peopled? For though we should grant that the 2 continents never were joined, yet they lie so near to each other that the possibility of the inhabitants of Asia going over to America, especially considering the number of the islands and the coldness of the climate, cannot be denied, all right? So again, we dodged the hijack big time. No, we already debunked all that. America's the true old world, the oldest land out of the primordial waters, the oldest civilization, first agriculture, oldest fossils, oldest human bones, everything. We have found this here, oldest agriculture, right? We found all that here. So we dodged the hijack in there. Theory right here, right? They're just theorizing at this point. They're trying to figure out where these Israelites came from because they think that the Holy Land's on the other side. They think the Middle East is the real place still. This author in the 1800s, right? From Barren's Island on its high mountains, you can see mountains covered with snow that appear to be capes of the mainland of America. From all which it appears clearly, they probably mean of people passing from Asia to America, they're guessing, either on the mainland before a separation, or from island to island, or they don't know, or on the ice after a separation, by which the continent of America might have been peopled by the tribes of Israel wandering northeast, and directed by the unseen hand of providence, and thus they entered into a country wherein mankind never before dwelt. All right, so he's quoting Ezra, the book of Ezra here, trying to say, oh, that they meant the Bering Strait. That's what he's trying to say. It is not presumed that the 10 tribes of Israel alone did this. Many of the inhabitants might have gone with them from Tartary or Scythia. Who's the Scythians? Those sons of Isaac. Yeah, who's the Tartans? Original Tartans. And particularly the old inhabitants of Damascus, who were carried away in the first place by Tiglath-Pileser before his conquest of the Israelites, and were their neighbors, and perhaps as much dissatisfied with their place of banishment, though for different reasons, as the Israelites, as well as from Kamchatka on their way where they were stopped sometime, as the Egyptians did with the Israelites of old, just like the Egyptians did. And indeed, it is not improbable, as has before been hinted, that some few or other nations who traded on the seas might in so long a course of time have been driven by stress of weather and reached the Atlantic shores at different places, but the great body of people settling in North and South America must have originated from the same source. Dodge the hijack. So they're trying to say they're all from Asia, Bering Strait, they might have, probably might have, must have, guessing, right? This part of the book, guys, he's just theorizing. He's trying to conclude. This is the dismount, right? We're almost done. He's trying to say maybe they got here like this. So because people's gonna ask him, right, when they're reading his book, like, well, if these are Israelites and Hebrews, how did they get here? When? How? There's oceans here. How would they? Remember, guys, navigation started here. I just did a video recently about the stone fields in Costa Rica. Go check out that video. How we had ancient navigation here since ancient times. We were the ones teaching people how to navigate. We were making ships, guys. Remember, we went out. We went out and got caught in currents and landed up in Europe and Asia and all those places. The stories are already there. They've seen it in reverse. Hence, it would not be surprising to find among their descendants a mixture of the Asiatic languages, manners, customs, and peculiarities. See, they're calling Hebrew. They're calling all these old world languages Asiatic. That's what he means. He doesn't mean somebody speaking Chinese and, modern day Chinese people speaking Chinese. He's not talking about Asia. Remember, Asia is India, Hindu, Hebrew, Middle East, all that. They consider all that Asia, right? Nay, it would appear rather extraordinary and uncountable if this was not so. And if we should find this to be the case, it would greatly corroborate the fact of their having passed into America from the northeast point of Asia, according to the Indian tradition. The Indians never said nothing about no Asia or Lambridge or Bering Strait. See, he's adding that. We at the present day can hardly conceive of the facility with which these wandering northern nations removed from one part of the country to the other. The Tartans at this time who possessed that northern country live in tents or covered carts and wandered from place to place in search of pasture. The general character, manners, and habits and customs of the Indians have been very generally misrepresented. Okay? Listen to what he's saying. It is quite certain that at the time of the discovery of this continent by Columbus, again, he didn't discover anything because you can't discover a place where there's already millions of people already there, right? It was peopled by some thousands of tribes, not thousands. Yeah, well, maybe hundreds of thousands of tribes, right? Possibly millions, scattered from the coast opposite Kamchatka to Hudson's Bay. Their exact number has never been ascertained, and at this time it is impossible. Generation after generation, tribe after tribe have gone down to the grave, and of some great and powerful nations there is not a solitary survivor left. It seems as if the destroying angel, the destroying angel had passed over the country, a Dracan with his flames, right? The Dracan, destroying angel, huh? And that the numerous unhappy natives had looked on him and died. Mr. Boudinot mentions 190 different nations, each having a king and Sakim. Duprat's in his History of Louisiana, Volume 1, pages 108 to 123, gives an account of the single nation of the Paducas, lying west by northwest of the Missouri in 1724, which may give a faint idea of the numbers originally inhabiting this vast continent. He says the nations of the Paducas is very numerous, extends almost 200 leagues, and they have villages quite close to the Spaniards of New Mexico. They are not to be considered as a wandering nation, though employed in hunting, summer and winter. Seeing they have large villages, consisting of a great number of cabins, which contain very numerous families. These are permanent abodes, from which 100 hunters set out at a time with their horses, with their bows and a good stock of arrows. The village where we were consisted of 140 huts, containing about 800 warriors, 1,500 women, and at least 2,000 children, some Paducas having 4 wives. The natives of North America derive their origin from the same country, since at the bottom they all have the same manners and usages, as also the same manners of speaking and thinking. Mr. Jefferson, the late President of the United States, in his notes on Virginia, has also given much useful information to the world on several important subjects relating to America, and among others, as to the numbers of the Indians in that then dominion. Speaking of the Indian Confederacy, of the warriors, or rather nations, in that state, its neighborhood, called the Powhatan Confederacy, says it contained in point of territory, as he supposes, of their patrimonial country, almost 300 miles in length and 100 in breadth, right? That's a lot of territory. That there was about 1 inhabitant for every square mile, and the proportion of warriors to the whole number of inhabitants was in 3 to 10, making the number of souls about 30,000. Some writers state the number of their warriors at the first coming of the Europeans to Virginia to be 15,000, and their population 50,000. La Houtan says that each village contained about 14,000 souls, that is 1,500 that bore arms, 2,000 superannuated men, 4,000 women, 2,000 maids, and 4,500 children, from all which it is but a moderate estimate to suppose that there were 600,000 fighting men or warriors on this continent at its first discovery. Now, so remember, guys, a lot of the time, by the time these people are writing their numbers, they don't know all the people who's in the nation, who are they related to, who they have similar relationships with, family ties, kinship, and other nations. And a lot of the Indians have been already murdered, relocated, enslaved. By the time these people are like writing, they've been dispersed, relocated, reclassified as slaves, Negroes, Africans, all that. Yeah. So we gotta, we touched the hijack a little bit with the numbers, but what he's trying to point out is that the Indians were very populous, right? These are just some few accounts he's pointing out. Like, look at thousands and thousands of them in each tribe. So in 1677, Colonel Kersey, an agent for Virginia, had a conference with the 5 nations at Albany. The number of warriors was estimated at that time in those nations at the following rate: Mohawks 300, Oneidas 200, Onondagas 350, Cayugas 300, Senecas 1,000, total 2,150, which makes the population about 7,200. Vidas Chalmers' Political Annals 606. Right, again, are they really counting all the Indians? Right, this is what I'm saying. That's his numbers. These are people's personal numbers, right? So Smith, in his History of New York, says that in 1756 the number of fighting men were about 1,200. Douglas, in his History of Massachusetts, says that they were about 1,500 in 1760. Again, remember that a lot of times, and we've gotten this account already before, that a lot of these accounts, they were lying about the numbers, so people wouldn't think that they were over here killing, murdering hundreds of thousands or millions of Indians or enslaving them, right? Oh, where'd you get all these slaves? Oh, no, we got them from Africa. They're not Indians. There was only 1,500 Indians here, not 30,000. Well, you get what I'm saying? They enslaved 30,000 and said, oh, there was only 1,500 here. In 1764, Colonel Pequot stated that the whole number of the inhabitants, he must mean fighting men, at 1,550. Captain Hutchins in 1768 stated them at 2,120, and Dodge, an Indian trader, in 1779 at 1,600 in the third year of the American Revolutionary War. Many reasons may be assigned for the above differences. See, even these people don't agree when they're talking about the same people. Some may have stayed at home for the defense of their towns. Some might be absent, feeding on disputes with their neighbors or sickness. During the above war in 1776 to 77, the British had in their service, according to the returns of their agent, Mohawks 300, Oneidas 150, Tuscaroras 200, Onondagos 300, Cayugas 200, and 30 Senecas 400, in the whole 1,580. The Americans had about 220, making up 1,800 warriors, equal to about 6,000 souls. In 1783, Mr. Kirkland, missionary to the Oneidas, estimated the number of the Seneca warriors at 600 and the total number of the Six Nations at more than 4,000. It's got to be a lot more than that, you know? In 1790, he made the whole number of Indian inhabitants then remaining, in addition those who reside on Grand River in Canada and the Stockbridge and Brothertown Indians, to be 6,330. In 1794, the Six Nations numbered 7,148 souls. But what are these to the Southern Indians, and especially those of Mexico and Peru? I will give one example. Monsignor Lepage Dupra, in his History of Louisiana, written about the year 1730, assures us that the nation of the Natchez, from whom the town of that name on the Mississippi is called, were the most powerful nation in North America. The Natchez were actually the warrior faction of the Muskogee-speaking nations, guys. They were the warriors, okay? They were the soldiers. Literally, they were the soldiers. They were like soldiers. Let's say they were the most powerful nation, right? So they extended from the river Manchas or Iberville, which is about 50 leagues from the sea, to the river Wabash, which is about 460 leagues from the sea, and that they had 500 sakims in the nation. He further says that the Chatkas, or Flatheads, near the river Pachak Ogulas, had 25,000 warriors, but in which number he supposes many were reckoned who had but a slight title to that name. A distinguishing trait in the character of the Aborigines is that of unbounded hospitality. Mr. Bartram, who knew the Seminole Indians well, as he traveled among them considerably, says that they possess a vast territory, all East Florida, and the greatest part of West Florida, which being naturally cut and divided into thousands of islets, knolls, and eminences, by the innumerable rivers and lakes, swamps, savannas, and ponds, form so many secure retreats and temporary dwelling places that effectually guard them from any sudden invasion or attacks from their enemies. And being such a swampy, hammocky country, furnishes such a plenty and variety of supplies for the nourishment of every sort of animal, that I can venture to assert that no part of the globe so abounds with wild game or creatures fit for the food of man. It's talking about Florida, right? It kind of matches that the whole research of it being the true Garden of Eden location. Look at that, all the food and animals that are there. Thus, they enjoy a superabundance of the necessities and conveniences of life with the security of person and property, the two great concerns of mankind. They seem to be free from want or desires, no cruel enemy to dread, nothing to give them disquietude, but the gradual encroachments of the European people. Thus contented and undisturbed, they appear as blithe and free as the birds of the air, and like them as volatile and active, tuneful and vociferous. The visage, action, and deportment of a Seminole, being the most striking picture of happiness in this life, joy, contentment, love, and friendship, without guile or affectation, seem inherent in them, or predominance in their vital principle, for it leaves them but with the last breath of life. to exemplify their kindness to strangers. He says that having lost his way in traveling through their towns, he was at a stand how to proceed, when he observed an Indian man at the door of his habitation, beckoning him to come to him. Bartram accordingly rode up to him. He cheerfully welcomed him to his house, took care of his horse, and with the most graceful air of respect led him into an airy, cool apartment, where being seated on cabins, his women brought in a refreshing repast, with a pleasant cool liquor to drink, then pipes and tobacco. After an hour's conversation, Mr. Bartram informed him of his business and where he was bound, but having lost his way, he did not know how to go on. The Indian cheerfully replied that he was pleased that Mr. B was come into their country, where he should meet with friendship and protection, and that he would himself lead him into the right path. He turned out to be the prince or chief of Watoga. How long would an Indian have rode through our country before he would have received such kindness from a common farmer, much less a chief magistrate of a country? Mr. Bartram adds to the testimony of Father Charleville in favor of their good characters among themselves. He says they are just, honest, liberal, and hospitable to strangers, considerate, loving, affectionate to their wives and relations. All right, you guys hear that? This is the Indian's character, fond of their children, frugal and persevering, charitable and forbearing. He was weeks and months among them in their town, and never observed the least sign of contention or wrangling, never saw an instance of an Indian beating his wife or even reproving her in anger. You guys hear that? Continuing, says Colonel John Smith says, when we had plenty of green corn and roasting ears, the hunters became lazy and spent their time in singing and dancing. How's that lazy? They're chilling. They appeared to be fulfilling the scriptures, beyond many of those who profess to believe them, in that of taking no thought for tomorrow, but in living in love, peace, and friendship without disputes. In this last respect, they are an example to those who profess Christianity. These are true Christians, even though they're not Christians, they're acting what the supposed Christians are supposed to do, right? Continuing, it says, as the Israelites were divided into tribes and had a chief over them, and always marched under ensigns of some animal, right? The totems peculiar to each tribe. So the Indian nations are universally divided into tribes under a Sakim or king, chosen by the people from the wisest and the bravest among them. He has neither influence or distinction, but from his wisdom and prudence. He is assisted by a council of old wise and benevolent men, as they call their priest and counselor. Nothing is determined of a public nature, but in this council, where everyone has an equal voice, the chief or Sakim sits in the middle, and the council on each hand forming a semicircle, as the high priest of the Jews or Israelites did in the Sanhedrin of that nation, just like the Israelite priest. The Indians got the same thing, guys. Mr. Penn, when he first arrived in Pennsylvania in the year 1683 and made a treaty with them, makes the following observations in a letter he then wrote to his friends in England. All right, remember the letters of William Penn, how he was saying they are black in complexion, dark, these are black folk, black Indians, and they are like the Hebrews, remember. So let's quote Mr. Penn. It says here, every king has his council, and that consists of all the old and wise men of his nation, which perhaps are 200 people. Nothing of moment is undertaken, be it war, peace, selling of land, or traffic, without advising with them. 'Tis admirable to consider how powerful the chiefs are, and yet how they move by the breath of the people. I have had occasion to be in council with them upon treaties for land, and to adjust the terms of trade. Their order is thus: the king sits in the middle of an half moon, and has his council, the old and wise, on each hand. Behind them, at a little distance, sit the young fry in the same figure. Having consulted and resolved their business, the king ordered one of them to speak to me. He came to me, and in the name of his king saluted me, then took me by the hand, and told me that he was ordered by his king to speak to me, and that now it was not he, but the king who spoke, because what he should say was the king's mind. During the time this person was speaking, not a man of them was observed to whisper or smile. The old were grave, the young revered, reverent in their deportment. They spoke little, but fervently and with elegance. He will deserve the name of wise, who outwits them in any treaty about a thing they understand. At every sentence they shout and say amen in their way. Wow. They even say amen after they talk. This is William Penn, right? They quote in William Penn, primary source. Mr. Smith, in his History of New Jersey, confirms this general statement. They are grave even to sadness, upon any common and more so upon serious occasions, observant of those in company, and respectful to the age, of a temper cool and deliberate, never in haste to speak, but wait for certainty that the person who spake before them had finished all he had to say. They seemed to hold European vivacity and contempt, because they found such as came among them apt to interrupt each other and frequently speak altogether. Their behavior in public councils was strictly decent and instructive, every one in his turn according to rank of years or wisdom or services to his country. Not a word, whisper, or murmur was heard while anyone spoke to interruption, to commend or condemn. The younger sort were totally silent. Those denominated kings were sakims, distinguished by their wisdom and good conduct. The respect paid them was voluntary and not exacted or looked for, nor the omission regarded. The sakims directed in their councils and had the chiefs disposition of their lands. All right, that's what he was saying. Every nation of Indians have certain customs which they observe in their public transactions with other nations and in their private affairs among themselves, which is scandalous for anyone among them not to observe. And these always draw after them either public or private resentment whenever they are broken. Although these customs may, in their detail, differ in one nation when compared with another, yet it is easy to discern that they have all had one origin. This is also apparent from every nation understanding them. Mr. Colden says, their great men, both sakims and captains, are generally poorer than the common people, for they affect to give way and distribute all the presents or plunder they get in their treaties or in war, so as to leave nothing to themselves. All right, you guys hear that? There is not a man in the ministry of the Five Nations of whom Mr. Colden was writing who has gained his office otherwise than by merit, all right? Not by force, not through fake elections. There is not the least salary or any sort of profit annexed to any office to tempt the covetous or the sordid, but on the contrary, every unworthy action is unavoidably attended with the forfeiture of their commission, for the authority is only the esteem of the people, and ceases the moment that esteem is lost. An old Mohawk sakim in a poor blanket and a dirty shirt may be seen issuing his orders with an arbitrary and authority as a Roman dictator. All right. So basically, these leaders, these priests, these kings, guys, they're very righteous, humble, considerate, loving people. They are great leaders. They are wise. They're not there looking for power, dictatorship, so in order for them to be corrupt or have money or be more financially well off than everybody else, like today's leaders, like today's politicians, like today's kings, like today's presidents, right? It's not about the money. They weren't even getting paid. All right, none of that. Continuing, as every nation, as before observed, has its peculiar standard or symbol, as an eagle, a bear, a wolf, or an otter, so has each tribe like badge from which it is denominated. When they encamp on a march, they always cut the representation of their ensign or symbol on the trees. You guys hear that? Even if they're not carrying their totem, they'll draw it wherever they're, settling or camping out. Wow. By which it may be known who have been there. The sakim of each tribe is necessary party in all conveyances and treaties, to which he affixes the mark of his tribe, as a corporation does that of the public seal. Look, it's like their logo. Like they wore around with their emblem, their logo, right? Like a corporation does. The public seal. If you go from nation to nation, you will not find one who does not lineally distinguish himself by his respective family, as the family or tribe of the eagle, panther, which is their lion. This is their jaguar, right? Panther, the lion, or the tiger, right? Jaguar, buffalo, their ox or bull, and also the bear, deer, raccoon, etc. So among the Jews, or the Israelites, right? The lion of the tribe of Judah, Dan was known by the serpent, Issachar by an ass, Benjamin by a wolf. But the Indians, just like the Israelites, pay no religious respect for any of these animals or for any other whatever, meaning they don't worship these things. It's just their emblems, their logos. They reckon time after the manner of the Hebrews. They reckon their calendars, right? Their time periods, just like the Hebrews, just like the Israelites, right? This is the American Indians. We're getting primary sources, right? They divide the year into spring, summer, autumn, or the falling of the leaf and winter. Korah is their word for winter with the Cherokee Indians, as it is with the Hebrews. Same word. They number the years by any of these 4 periods, for they have no name for a year, and they subdivide these and count the year by lunar months or moons, like the Israelites, just like the Israelites, by lunar months, who also counted by moons. They called the sun and moon by the same word, with the addition of day and night as the day sun or moon, the night sun or moon. And we know what word that was, right? Is Jesus. That's literally talking about the word Jesus. Geezis is how you can kind of spell the sound of the word they use. They literally called the sun and the moon Jesus. I have a video on this, guys. Check it out. That's what they called the sun. Jesus, the same word. And then, like, one of them is night Jesus, or the night sun, which is the moon. They count the day by 3 sensible differences of the sun, like the Hebrews, as the sun coming out, midday, and the sun is dead, or sunset. Midnight is halfway between the sun going in and coming out of the water, also by midnight and cock crowing. They begin their ecclesiastical year at the first vernal equinox, according to the ecclesiastical year of Moses. They pay great regard to the first appearance of every new moon. They name the various seasons of the year from the planting and ripening of the fruits. The green-eared moon is the most beloved or sacred. When the first fruits become sanctified, right, just like the Israelites, they offer the first fruits of the first corn ears, right? They become sanctified by being annually offered up, and from this period they count their beloved or holy things, just like the Israelites. The greatest act of hostility towards a nation is to profane the graves of their dead. That's like a big sin to the Indians, right? Big disrespect to them and the Most High, the Great Spirit. And if one of their nation dies at a distance, they secure the body from birds and wild beasts. And when they imagine the flesh is consumed and the bones dry, they return to the place, bring them home, and inter them in a very solemn manner. The Hebrews, in like manner, carefully buried their dead, but on any accident they gathered their bones and laid them in the tombs of their forefathers. Thus Jacob charged his sons and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. This was in Canaan. This was again in America. Ancient Canaan, the real Cananda, was in America. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and we shall carry my bones from hence. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem. As above mentioned, Joshua 34:32, the Israelites buried near their cities, and sometimes opposite to their houses, implying a silent lesson of friendship and a caution to live well. They buried families together, but strangers apart by themselves. When an old Indian finds that it is probable that he must die, he sends for his friends and with them collects his children and family around him. And then, with the greatest composure, he addresses them in the most affectionate manner, giving them his last counsel and advising them to such conduct as he thinks for their best interest. So did the patriarchs of old, and the Indians seemed to follow their steps, and with as much coolness as Jacob did to his children when he was about to die. Just like the patriarchs, and Jacob and the ones chosen by the Most High to lead, they did the same, just like the Indians, did counseled, when they're about to die. A very worthy clergyman with whom the writer was well acquainted, and who had long preached to the Indians, informed him that many years ago, having preached in the morning to a considerable number of them in the recess between the morning and afternoon services, news was suddenly brought that the son of an Indian woman, one of the congregation then present, had fallen into a mill dam and was drowned. Immediately the disconsolate mother retired to some distance in deep distress and sat down on the ground. Her female friends soon followed her and placed themselves in like manner around her, in a circle at a small distance. They continued a considerable time in profound and melancholy silence, except now and then uttering a deep groan. All at once the mother, putting her hand on her mouth, fell with her face flat on the ground, her hand continuing on her mouth. This was followed in like manner by all the rest, while all cried out with the most melancholy and dismal yellings and groanings. Thus they continued with their hands on their mouths, and their mouths in the dust of a considerable time. The men also retired to a distance from them, and went through the same ceremony, making most dismal groanings and yellings. Need any reader be reminded of the Jewish customs or Israelite customs on occasions of deep humiliation, as in Job 21:5? Mark me, and be astonished, and lay your hand on your mouth. In 29:9, the princes refrained, taken, and laid their hands on their mouth. 49:4, behold, I am vile, that shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand on my mouth. Micah 7:16, the nations shall see and be confounded. They shall lay their hands on their mouths. Lamentations 3:7, he putteth his mouth in the dust, if so be there may be hope. Proverbs 30:32, if thou hast through evil laid thine hand upon thine mouth. The Choctaw Indians hire mourners. Listen, the Choctaw Indians hire mourners to magnify the merit and loss of the dead. And if their tears do not flow, their shrill voices will be heard to cry, which answers the solemn chorus much better. However, some of them have the art of shedding tears abundantly. Jeremiah says here 9, chapter 17:19, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider ye, and call for the mourning women, that they may come, and send for cunning women, that may come, for a voice of wailing is heard. All right, and that is the end. I mean, he can probably give a lot more examples, but that was a lot, guys. That was a lot of reading, but I hope you guys understand why I read this. I know it was pretty long. It's, this guy's writings from the early 1800s. But look at all the drop he gave us, all the primary sources he quoted, and his opinion, which counts a lot because he is an Indian. He is one of the Pequots, more than a European. And he was supposedly had some African in him, so he was black, right? He was melanated. And this is what he was saying. This is what he was writing at this time, trying to convince people, trying to show people a different history of his people and what happened to the American Indians, all the atrocities and who they were, how their character was, and how they are the lost tribes of Israel. These are the biblical people. If anybody was to represent and live like the people of the Bible, it was the American Indians. And that's what the Europeans encountered and saw and realized. The ones who actually made time to get to know them, live with them, talk to them, right? They saw that these were the lost tribes of Israel, or the ancient Israelites, the people of the Bible, the chosen people, all right? I hope you guys enjoyed this reading today. Now we know who William Apes is and what he had to say, and what happened to the Pequot and many of the Indians and many of their characters and traditions. In case you're new to my channel, we've gone over this in different, more specific sources, all right, from different people over the last 8 years. We've proven America's a true old world. This is the true Holy Lands. All right, you guys, you see, just another book, another person letting you know from this time, another book that they hid from us. They never showed us or talked to us about. They sugarcoated this history. They downplayed the history. They wanted us to think all the American Indians were just savages, all part of Siberian so-called Mongols or something like that, whatever they want you to think, right? But all that is wrong, guys. Get those stereotypes, get those indoctrinated ideas, perspectives out of your head. Empty your cup. We're talking about real history here, a real people, and we might be talking about your people, your ancestors, as the real biblical people. All right. Thanks for tuning in all the way until the end of the reading today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the reading. Hope it wasn't too boring. I just wanted to get this read. I had this for a long time. I just looked at one of my notes the other day. I was like, oh, I haven't even read this yet. I had it for years, guys, 5, 6, 7 years. I don't know how long. In my drive, all these books, all these researches. And so I just wanted to get this read today to you. Hope you enjoyed it. All right, real history here. The lost tribes of Israel. Hawa's people, the Great Spirit. Yahweh. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.